What was the night sky like before the moon fully stabilized, before it learned how to hold its distance, before its gravity softened into habit, before tides trusted its pull enough to sleep? Wherever you are tonight, in whatever quiet has found you, I'm glad you're here. This is not a story meant to teach. It is a story meant to settle, to move slowly, like dust returning to stone, to listen for the memory beneath the light, long before calendars, before names, before the sky learned how to repeat itself. Earth looked upward into a darkness that did not yet agree to stay the same, and it remembered. Night did not arrive gently then, it arrived unevenly, like something still deciding where to land. Darkness slid across the surface of the planet without rhythm, without promise. It gathered in hollows and withdrew again, leaving behind no clear edge. The stars were present, but their arrangement felt temporary, as if they might loosen and fall. Above the young Earth, the sky was not yet a ceiling. It was a moving field of pressure, stretched and tugged by forces that had not learned restraint. The moon was there, but it was not yet a companion. It hovered closer than memory would later allow, large and unsettled, its gravity reaching downward with a grip that had not learned gentleness. Light spilled from it unevenly, bright in some nights, strangely dim in others, its face shifting as distance changed by degrees too small to name, yet large enough to be felt by oceans that had not learned how to rest. Water listened first. The seas rose without agreement. They pulled themselves inland, then retreated too far, leaving exposed stone cooling under unfamiliar stars. Coastlines existed briefly, then vanished. What would later be called tides had no names yet. They were only responses, movements shaped by a pull that came too close, too strong, too often. Stone felt it too. The crust flexed beneath the pressure, not cracking loudly, but bending, storing the sensation like a held breath. Mountains were not yet witnesses. They were still becoming. The ground remembered each uneven night as compression, as heat, as silent adjustment. Nothing resisted. There was no reason to. Resistance requires expectation, and expectation had not yet formed. Above it all, the sky shifted. Stars traced paths that did not yet feel circular. Their rising points wandered. Constellations had no patience. Light crossed the darkness differently from one night to the next, stretched thin by a moon still learning how far away it needed to be. Shadows elongated and snapped back, unsure whether they were meant to stay. Time did not pass here. It drifted. Each night layered itself over the last without alignment, like ash falling without wind. There was no cycle to trust, no repetition strong enough to become memory. Darkness was an event that kept changing its shape, and the Earth received it without protest. The moon pulled. The planet answered. Between them, gravity whispered instructions that were still incomplete. The pull was real, but its cadence was erratic. Oceans surged higher than they would later dare. The moon's closeness carved reactions into water long before life learned how to read them. Salt scattered. Minerals dissolved and returned. Chemistry moved, not toward purpose but toward possibility. Light reflected off restless surfaces, breaking itself apart. The moon's glow did not settle. It fractured on waves that rose too fast, collapsed too deeply. Reflections never repeated. No night looked back at itself and recognized what it had been before. Silence lived here, but not peace. It was the silence of a system still listening to itself, unsure which signals mattered. Space pressed in, not as emptiness, but as distance still being negotiated. The moon drifted outward by moments so small they felt like hesitation. Each retreat softened the pull slightly, but not enough yet, not enough to teach consistency. Below, the Earth kept its own counsel. It did not look upward. It absorbed. Heat moved through stone. Water traced temporary paths. Pressure sank into layers that would one day be fossils of feeling rather than form. Memory was not stored as images or events, but as deformation, as subtle changes in how matter arranged itself after being asked to respond. The sky offered no reassurance. Clouds, when they gathered, did not yet know how to linger. They formed and dissolved, stretched thin by uneven light. Darkness fell earlier, some nights, later others. The concept of night as a duration had not yet arrived. It was simply an interval, sometimes brief, sometimes vast. Stars whispered across that interval, without pattern. Their light travelled faithfully, but its arrival met a world that could not yet receive it the same way twice. The moon's presence bent paths slightly, enough to remind the sky that nothing here was fixed. Even light felt provisional. And yet, within that instability, something quiet began. Not order, not balance, but attention. Water began to feel where it had been pulled before. Stone retained stress lines that mirrored earlier nights. The earth, without knowing it, was learning the idea of repetition by noticing its absence. Each uneven pull wrote a contrast against the last. Difference became information. The moon did not intend this teaching. It simply existed too close. Its surface, still scarred from its own violent becoming, reflected light without softness. Its gravity spoke loudly without modulation. But even loud forces tire themselves. Even closeness erodes into distance. Outward, always outward, the moon moved, slowly enough to feel like staying. Each night's pull was nearly the same as the last, but never exactly. The Earth noticed not because it could think, but because matter remembers pressure. Somewhere in that noticing, the night began to thin, not yet into pattern, not yet into trust, but into something less chaotic than before. The sky still would not hold still, but it hesitated longer between changes, and what hesitates long enough can one day be remembered. The moon continued its slow forgetting of closeness, not as departure, not as decision, but as drift, so gradual, it felt like stillness pretending to move. Each night its pull loosened by an amount too small for oceans to name, yet large enough for memory to begin forming. Water did not calm, it learned hesitation. The surge inland arrived with slightly less urgency. The retreat paused, as if unsure whether it would be called back again. These pauses became spaces where matter could notice itself. The night sky, once restless, began to carry weight. Darkness no longer rushed in unevenly. It gathered with more patience, spreading like breath held longer than before. Stars returned to similar places, not the same places, but close enough to feel familiar. Their light did not promise repetition yet, but it hinted, a faint suggestion that the sky might someday remember its own arrangement. The moon still loomed large. Its face dominated the darkness, bright enough to cast shadows that stretched too far, too sharp. Stone shadows cracked against slopes. Water shadows fractured and reassembled with every surge. Yet these shadows began to linger a fraction longer before dissolving. Length became something that could be compared. Comparison is a quiet beginning. The earth did not mark time, but it stored contrast. Nights that pulled harder pressed deeper into sediment. Nights that pulled less allowed layers to settle. This alternation, uneven, imperfect, etched subtle rhythms into rock and seabed alike. Nothing recognized them as cycles, but the conditions for cycles were being rehearsed. Gravity softened its voice, not intentionally, simply through distance. With each outward breath of the moon, the force that once overwhelmed began to suggest instead of command. The ocean's surface still rose high, but not as violently. Waves broke with slightly more predictability, their collapse tracing similar arcs along coastlines that still refused to stay in place. Coastlines learned erasure. They were written and rewritten so often that permanence lost meaning. What mattered was not where land met water, but how often that meeting returned. The night sky reflected in these meetings, light broken into shimmering fragments, never whole and never stable but less chaotic than before. Above, space listened. The stars did not change their stories, but their paths across the sky began to slow their wandering. Not because the stars had moved, but because the Earth's rotation, tugged less aggressively, found a gentler consistency. The length of night stretched, then steadied. Darkness learned how long it could stay without being interrupted. Silence deepened. Not the silence of emptiness, but of systems aligning quietly. The moon's gravity no longer shouted across the void. It spoke in sustained tones, long enough for water to answer in similar ways twice, sometimes 3 times, before being surprised again. These repetitions were fragile. They broke easily. They were forgotten often. But each time they returned, they left residue. Patterns too faint to see but strong enough to influence the next response. The Earth's surface became a palimpsest of almost memories, each new night writing over the last without fully erasing it. Light began to behave differently. Moonlight, once harsh and sprawling, softened as distance grew. Shadows shortened, learned restraint. They no longer reached endlessly across plains. They stayed closer to their sources, hugging stone and wave with a gentler confidence. Darkness became less jagged, more continuous. Still, the sky refused to settle. Clouds crossed unevenly, lit from beneath by a moon still too near to be subtle. Some nights glowed brighter than others, some nights felt thin, as if darkness had been diluted. Variation remained the rule, but now it carried echoes. Echoes matter. They allow matter to anticipate without knowing why. Water began to respond before the pull fully arrived. Stone flexed less violently, having learned where strain would concentrate. Heat dispersed more evenly. The planet adjusted its posture, not in response to any single night, but to the accumulation of nights that felt almost the same. The moon continued outward. Its motion was silent, but its effects were not. Each fraction of distance rewrote gravity's script. The force that once sculpted chaos now began to carve order slowly, unintentionally. The night sky became less dramatic, more dependable, though dependability had not yet earned trust. Trust takes time. Time here was still thick. It did not flow forward. It pressed downward, compacting experience into layers. The Earth did not move on from unstable nights. It folded them inward, storing them beneath emerging regularity. Even as the sky hinted at pattern, the memory of unpredictability remained close like a scar that has not yet learned how to fade. Stars watched without comment. Their light continued its long journeys, arriving at a world slowly becoming capable of receiving it in similar ways more than once. The sky began to feel less like a question, and more like a surface, something that could be looked through rather than endured. But this was not stability, it was rehearsal. The moon had not yet found its distance, the night had not yet learned how to repeat itself fully. Still, something irreversible had begun. Darkness had lingered long enough to be remembered, and memory had started to weigh more than surprise. And what begins to be remembered is already changing. Night learned patience before it learned form. It did not arrive all at once anymore. Darkness gathered slowly now, like sediment settling through water that has finally paused long enough to notice gravity. The edge of night softened. It no longer cut across the planet with the same uneven haste. Instead, it spread, testing its own weight, seeing how long it could remain before being disturbed. Above, the moon continued its quiet withdrawal. Distance accumulated the way dust does, grain by grain, invisible until it alters the surface it rests upon. The pull weakened, not enough to be absent, but enough to feel less invasive. Ocean still rose, still answered, but their response carried a new hesitation, a moment of listening before movement. Water began to remember the shape of the pull that preceded it. Memory does not announce itself, it settles. The seas no longer surged blindly. Their motion gained a faint rhythm, not reliable, not exact, but recognizable. Some nights felt like earlier nights. Some waves arrived with a familiarity that lingered after they broke. Salt traced similar paths across stone. Minerals dissolved and returned to places they had visited before. These returns mattered. They layered the world with expectation without awareness. Shorelines still wandered, but their wandering slowed. Land learned which edges would be touched more often than others. Valleys deepened quietly, guided by repetition rather than force. The night sky reflected in these waters more coherently, its fractured light rearranging itself in ways that began to echo previous reflections. The moon's light changed texture. It softened not because it dimmed, but because the surfaces it touched became calmer. Less violent water reflects more gently. Stone, flexing less, held shadows with steadier edges. Darkness became less restless, more continuous. It lingered without tension, allowing the stars to feel less temporary. Stars in turn seemed to pause. Their position stabilized enough to suggest paths rather than wanderings. The sky did not lock itself into constellations yet, but it flirted with the idea. Points of light returned near where they had been before, close enough to create familiarity without certainty. Familiarity is fragile. It breaks easily. But once tasted, it leaves hunger behind. The Earth absorbed this hunger without knowing it. Matter began to align its responses. The crust flexed with less surprise. Heat travelled more predictable routes. Stress lines in rock overlapped older stress lines, reinforcing rather than erasing them. The planet's body learned how to prepare for night instead of simply enduring it. Silence deepened again, not because movement ceased, but because it synchronized. Motions overlapped. Waves followed waves, shadows followed shadows. The moon's pull stretched across longer intervals, its voice no longer sharp but sustained. This sustained pressure taught the Earth a subtle lesson. Not every force arrives to disrupt. Some arrive to guide. Guidance does not require intention. The moon did not choose this role. It earned it by leaving. Each incremental retreat reduced chaos and invited order there without demanding it. The night sky responded by becoming a place where repetition could survive long enough to matter. Darkness stayed. Light returned. The interval between them thickened into something that could be felt. Time began to collect weight, not as measurement, as presence. Nights accumulated in sequence, not alignment. They leaned against one another, sharing edges, sharing memories of how long darkness had lasted, how deeply gravity had pressed. The Earth began to carry night within itself, even during day. Tides did not forget immediately when light returned. They held the moon's influence longer, like a word echoing after it has been spoken. This echo mattered. It allowed anticipation. Water rose slightly before the pull peaked. Stone tightened in advance. The planet began to respond not just to the present night, but to remembered nights. Response shifted from reaction to resonance. Above, clouds began to behave differently. They no longer scattered aimlessly. Their formations lingered, drawn by more stable temperature gradients beneath a calmer night. Moonlight filtered through them in patterns that sometimes repeated. Some nights glowed in ways that felt eerily similar to others. Similarity crept in quietly, without celebration. Darkness learned boundaries. It stopped spilling unpredictably into daylight. Twilight stretched, thickened, became an interval rather than a blur. The sky began to practice transitions. This practice laid the groundwork for patience, for waiting, for the slow unfolding that would one day make observation possible. Still, instability lingered. The moon was not yet distant enough to release its full control. Tides still surged higher than they would later allow. Shadows still stretched too far on certain nights. Variation remained dominant. But now, variation moved around a center, rather than scattering endlessly. A center is a powerful idea. It does not need to be fixed to matter. It only needs to be approached often enough. The night sky began to orbit its own habits. Stars returned close enough to suggest routes. The moon rose and fell with increasing regularity. Darkness lasted long enough to feel intentional, even if intention did not exist. The Earth continued to store this emerging order. Every layer of sediment, every stress line, every eroded surface became a record of nights that were no longer entirely unpredictable. Memory deepened. Silence thickened. The planet began to carry the sky within its own structure. And somewhere in that carrying, the first promise formed. Not spoken, not known, but present. That the night might someday stay still long enough to be trusted. Stability did not arrive as an event. It arrived as erosion. The moon continued outward, its distance widening so slowly that no single night could claim the change. Gravity loosened its grip not by retreating, but by learning moderation. What had once pulled like urgency now pressed like reminder. The force remained, but its tone softened, lengthened, learned how to wait. The night sky responded by holding itself together. Darkness no longer scattered at the edges. It settled across the planet with increasing confidence, lingering long enough for its weight to be felt. The stars no longer seemed temporary. Their paths curved with a patience that invited recognition. Not certainty yet, but orientation. The sky began to feel less like a surface in motion and more like a place. Water felt this first. The seas rose and fell with less confusion. Their movement stretched across longer intervals, smoother arcs replacing sharp surges. Tides began to remember where they had been before, not consciously, not intentionally, simply through repetition, pressing itself into matter. The ocean learned how to return. Return is a form of memory. Each cycle carved deeper channels along coastlines that had stopped wandering so wildly. Landforms began to persist longer between erasures. Valleys deepened in familiar ways. Sediment settled where it had settled before, reinforcing patterns that had once been accidents. The moon's light reflected more cleanly now. Waves, calmer than before, held its glow instead of shattering it. Reflections lingered, stretching across water in lines that did not immediately dissolve. Shadows shortened further, learning restraint. Darkness became less dramatic, more reliable. The sky no longer demanded attention. It allowed it. Silence thickened again, but this silence was different. It was not the silence of instability listening for instruction. It was the silence of a system beginning to recognize itself. Motions aligned, intervals matched. Night followed night with enough similarity to invite expectation. Expectation settled gently. The Earth did not hope. It adapted. Rock layers began to align their responses to recurring stress. Heat flowed through predictable routes. Pressure redistributed itself with increasing efficiency. The planet's body learned how to prepare rather than brace. Night was no longer something to survive. It became something to accommodate. Stars traced arcs that began to feel intentional. Their movements across the sky, once wandering, now followed paths that repeated closely enough to suggest continuity. Constellations were not yet named, but they were rehearsed. Light returned to the familiar regions of darkness again and again, until familiarity itself became a presence. The moon rose and fell with growing regularity. Its face no longer shifted unpredictably. Phases hinted at pattern, though the pattern was still imperfect. Light waxed and waned in sequences that occasionally aligned with memory. Some nights looked like nights before them, some shadows fell where shadows had fallen earlier. This was enough. Not perfection, not balance, enough for the night to begin holding still. Time, once thick and directionless, began to stretch into sequences that could be sensed. Darkness arrived, stayed, and withdrew with increasing consistency. The boundary between night and day learned how to pause. Twilight deepened into an interval that mattered. Intervals matter. They create space for noticing, for waiting. The Earth began to carry night forward into day, not as memory alone, but as influence. Tides echoed lunar rhythms even under sunlight. Stone held the tension of darkness long after light returned. The planet became a vessel for cycles that no longer vanished immediately. Above, clouds moved differently. They formed along predictable gradients. They lingered longer, shaped by calmer nights and gentler transitions. Moonlight filtered through them into patterns that sometimes repeated exactly. Repetition stopped feeling accidental. The sky practiced staying the same, not perfectly, but closely enough to be trusted. Trust does not require certainty. It requires consistency that survives disappointment. The night still varied, storms still interrupted, shadows still surprised, but the underlying rhythm endured. The moon's distance had reached a threshold where gravity guided without overwhelming. The Earth responded by relaxing. Its surface shifted less violently. Erosion slowed. Processes stretched across longer spans. Change became gradual enough to be layered rather than erased. Memory deepened. Silence widened. The sky became a background, not absent, not ignored, but present without insistence. Stars no longer felt like intrusions, they belonged. Their light crossed the atmosphere and landed on a world capable of receiving it in similar ways across many nights. The moon's glow softened further, its brightness no longer dominating, but accompanying. The night learned humility. It did not demand to be noticed. It simply arrived, reliably, and stayed long enough to matter. Darkness became a condition rather than an event. The sky learned how to hold its shape. Still, beneath this emerging calm, older memories remained. The Earth did not forget the nights that had torn at it. Those earlier instabilities lived on in deep layers, in subtle asymmetries, in the restless edge that never fully vanished. Stability carried its own shadow, the memory of chaos folded beneath it. And so the sky held still, not because it had forgotten how to move, but because it had learned when not to. Stillness, when it finally arrived, did not feel new. It felt familiar, like something remembered rather than discovered. The moon had reached a distance where its presence no longer needed to announce itself. Gravity remained, but it no longer startled the planet into response. It arrived quietly, evenly, spreading its influence across time instead of space. The pull no longer arrived as insistence. It arrived as agreement. The night sky accepted this agreement without ceremony. Darkness came on time more often now, not measured, not counted, but felt. It stretched across the planet with a steadiness that allowed matter to relay into it. Stars appeared where they had appeared before, close enough to awaken recognition. Their light no longer felt provisional. It belonged to the night rather than interrupting it. Water moved with memory. Tides rose and fell along familiar edges, their reach moderated, their retreat patient. The sea learned how far it was allowed to go. Each return traced lines that had been traced before, deepening channels rather than inventing them. The ocean became less about reaction and more about rhythm. Rhythm does not hurry. It repeats until matter trusts it. The Earth trusted slowly. Layers of sediment settled with less disruption. Shorelines stopped wandering aimlessly and began to linger. Landforms endured long enough to accumulate detail. Valleys deepened by repetition, not violence. Hills softened under predictable erosion. Stone learned how to listen. Stress travelled along familiar paths now. Pressure no longer scattered randomly. It followed routes carved by earlier nights, reinforcing memory rather than overwriting it. The planet's surface became an archive, not of events, but of tendencies. Above, the moon's light became a companion rather than a force. Its glow spread evenly, no longer tearing reflections apart. Shadows formed and stayed within reasonable bounds. Darkness was no longer dramatic. It became a container, holding sound, holding heat, holding and silence grew wider, not empty. Full. The kind of fullness that arrives when systems stop arguing with themselves. Motion continued everywhere. Waves moved, clouds drifted, stars arced. But these movements aligned. They overlapped instead of colliding. The night became a place where differences could coexist without disruption. Time changed texture again. It no longer pressed downward like weight. It stretched outward like breath. Nights followed one another with enough consistency to feel continuous. The idea of sequence settled into the planet's body. Darkness stopped being singular. It became plural, many nights forming a longer presence. This presence mattered. It allowed the sky to become something that could be relied upon. Not predicted, not controlled, but expected. Expectation softened the Earth's responses further. Matter prepared itself before forces arrived. Anticipation replaced surprise. The moon rose and fell with quiet certainty. Its phases moved through cycles that began to feel complete. Light grew and faded in patterns that sometimes matched memory exactly. Shadows returned to the familiar angles. The sky rehearsed permanence without demanding it. Stars arranged themselves into loose constellations, not yet named, but noticed. Their repetition stitched the darkness together. Light traced paths that stayed close enough to earlier paths to suggest intention. The sky felt less infinite and more structured, not because it had shrunk, but because it had learned how to repeat itself. The Earth absorbed this structure deeply. The planet's rotation steadied. Day and night found balance not through equality, but through reliability. Twilight learned its place. Dawn and dusk thickened into meaningful thresholds. The sky no longer rushed transitions, it allowed them. Clouds lingered longer now, they formed patterns that sometimes returned intact. Moonlight filtered through them in ways that echoed earlier nights. The atmosphere learned how to hold light without scattering it unpredictably. Darkness deepened rather than fractured. Everything slowed, not into stillness, into coherence. The moon's distance continued to increase, but now the change felt almost imperceptible. Gravity adjusted so gradually that the planet could accommodate without disruption. The relationship settled into quiet maintenance. Maintenance is invisible. It leaves no monuments, only continuity. The night sky became background, not forgotten, but steady enough to support other processes. Silence no longer needed to defend itself. It expanded naturally, filling the space left by chaos. Yet beneath this calm, the Earth retained memory. Deep layers still carried the imprint of earlier instability. Subtle asymmetries remained. Tides still surged slightly higher on some nights than others. Shadows still stretched unexpectedly during certain alignments. The planet did not erase its past. It folded it inward. Folding preserves. It keeps older truths close enough to influence the present without interrupting it. The sky's stability rested on a foundation of remembered motion. The moon's restraint carried the echo of its former closeness. Nothing here was final. Stability was an arrangement, not an ending. The night held still because it had learned how to, because it remembered what it was like not to. And somewhere within that steadiness, the sky began to make room. Room for patience, room for noticing, room for what would come next. The night did not announce its readiness. Readiness arrived quietly, like a surface that has finally stopped trembling. The moon had settled into a distance where its presence no longer needed correction. Gravity no longer negotiated. It maintained. The pull that once carved confusion into water and stone now moved through them like a remembered song, familiar enough to follow without listening closely. Darkness accepted this maintenance. It arrived with a steadiness that no longer surprised the planet. Night gathered itself across the globe, not as an intrusion, but as a condition that belonged. Stars emerged in patient sequences, their light arriving where it had arrived before, close enough to form pathways through the dark. Pathways are memory made visible. They do not explain themselves, they simply persist. Water followed these pathways inward. Tides rose with restraint, fell with confidence. The sea learned its limits not as boundaries, but as habits. Each return reinforced the last. Motion became layered rather than scattered. The ocean stopped arguing with the moon and began to move with it. Stone felt this cooperation deeply. Pressure travelled along old routes, smoothing them rather than breaking new ones. Heat dispersed predictably, sinking and rising in familiar currents. The planet's body no longer braced for nightfall. It opened to it. Opening changed everything. When matter no longer resists, it listens, and when it listens long enough, it begins to carry meaning forward. The Earth carried night within itself now, not as darkness alone, but as rhythm. Rhythm spread quietly. It threaded through erosion, through sedimentation, through the slow folding of landscapes that no longer needed to be erased to be shaped. Valleys deepened because they had deepened before. Hills softened because they had softened many times already. Change became cumulative. Cumulative change is gentle. It does not demand attention. It becomes the background against which attention can exist. Above, the moon's light softened further, not dimming but maturing. Its glow spread evenly, no longer forcing contrast. Shadows became companions to form rather than distortions of it. Darkness stopped exaggerating edges. It allowed shapes to remain themselves. The night sky began to feel complete, not closed, not finished. Complete in the way a breath feels complete when it reaches the pause before release. Stars held their places long enough to be traced by memory alone. Their arcs across the sky repeated closely enough to suggest permanence. The idea of direction emerged, not north or south, but continuity. The sky could be followed. Following requires trust. Trust formed without awareness. The Earth trusted because nothing contradicted that trust often enough to break it. Night after night arrived within expectation. Variation still existed, but it circled a centre rather than scattering outward. Clouds moved with restraint now. They formed where they had formed before. They lingered where night allowed them to linger. Moonlight filtered through familiar veils, casting patterns that sometimes returned intact. The atmosphere learned how to hold light gently. Silence widened again, but now it carried depth. It was no longer the silence of adjustment or rehearsal. It was the silence of continuity, the kind that allows other sounds to emerge without being drowned out. Time settled into layers. Not measured layers, but lived ones. Nights stacked upon nights, each similar enough to the last to reinforce memory. Darkness no longer vanished at dawn without trace. It lingered in temperature, in moisture, in the slow breathing of the planet's surface. The moon continued its slow retreat. Even now, distance increased, but so gradually that the system barely noticed. Gravity adjusted in whispers, tides recalibrated without drama. The night sky remained intact through these adjustments, proving that stability did not require stillness, only patience. Patience deepened. The Earth's rotation smoothed. Day and night shared the surface with a quiet fairness. Twilight thickened into a meaningful interval, neither light nor dark, but a bridge that endured. Transitions learned how to last. The sky became something that could be remembered without looking. Its presence embedded itself into the planet's rhythm so deeply that it no longer needed constant observation. The night held still, not because it was fixed, but because it had learned how to change slowly enough to feel the same. Yet beneath this calm, memory remained awake. Deep layers still carried the imprint of nights when the moon had pulled too hard. Subtle asymmetries lingered. Small irregularities in tides, slight variations in shadow, faint echoes of earlier instability. The planet did not erase these traces. It kept them as reminders. Reminders are quiet teachers. They ensure that stability never forgets how it was earned. The sky's calm rested on a foundation of remembered chaos. The moon's restraint carried the memory of closeness. Darkness held within it the echo of nights that had refused to settle. And so the night became trustworthy without becoming forgetful. It held still because it remembered motion. It remained gentle because it remembered force. Above the Earth, the sky finally learned how to stay. Not forever, not absolutely, but long enough to allow something else to begin listening. Something small, something patient, something that would one day look up and feel that the night had always been this way. The night did not realize it had become dependable. Dependability does not arrive with awareness. It arrives when nothing interrupts it for long enough to feel natural. The moon remained where it was meant to be, far enough to soften its voice, close enough to still be heard. Its gravity no longer pulled at the earth like a question. It rested against it like an answer that did not need repeating. The force existed, steady and restrained, folded into the fabric of every night. Darkness responded by staying. It did not rush across the planet. It did not hesitate either. It arrived with a calm that felt earned, spreading evenly, filling spaces that no longer resisted it. Stars appeared not as visitors, but as residents, returning to the familiar regions of the sky with quiet reliability. The sky stopped rearranging itself. Not completely, but enough. Enough that memory no longer had to work to keep up. Enough that matter could respond before being surprised. Enough that night could be held inside the planet even while light returned. Water breathed in time with the moon now. Tides rose with composure and withdrew without confusion. The sea no longer tested its limits every night. It honored them. Each movement reinforced the last, turning repetition into trust. Channels deepened not because water forced its way through, but because it kept returning to the same paths. Returning changed everything. Landforms stopped arguing with erosion. They accepted it. Hills softened where they had softened before. Valleys deepened where water had already learned how to linger. The surface of the earth became less about resistance and more about memory. Stone remembered pressure gently. Stress lines aligned with older stress lines. Heat flowed through familiar routes. The planet no longer braced itself against nightfall. It welcomed it as part of its own rhythm. Darkness stopped feeling external. It became internal, something carried rather than endured. Above, the moon's light completed its transformation. No longer harsh, no longer dominant. It illuminated without overwhelming, revealing shape instead of distorting it. Shadows behaved. They stayed where they belonged. Darkness no longer exaggerated edges. It softened them, allowing form to exist without tension. Silence became expansive. Not the silence of absence, but of balance. Motion continued everywhere. Waves moved, air flowed, the planet rotated. But these motions no longer competed. They layered themselves, creating depth instead of noise. Time settled fully into continuity. Nights followed nights closely enough to feel connected. Darkness no longer reset itself each evening. It accumulated. It carried forward temperature, moisture, stillness. The idea of sequence became embedded in the planet's body. The moon continued its retreat even now. Distance still increased, but so slowly that it felt like permanence. Gravity adjusted imperceptibly. Tides recalibrated without disruption. The sky remained stable through these changes, proving that stability did not mean immobility. It meant coherence. The night sky became something that could be depended on without being watched. It held its shape across enough nights to allow the Earth to stop paying attention to it constantly. The sky faded into background, not because it was unimportant, but because it was no longer disruptive. And beneath this calm memory remained intact. Deep layers still carried echoes of nights that had pulled too hard. Slight irregularities in tides. Subtle asymmetries in erosion. The planet did not erase these reminders. It carried them quietly, folded beneath stability. Because stability that forgets its origin becomes brittle. The night held still because it remembered motion. The moon stayed distant because it remembered closeness. What the sky had been was never lost. It was absorbed, compressed into stone, dissolved into water, stretched across time until it no longer needed to speak loudly to be known. And so the sky learned how to stay. Not forever, not absolutely, but long enough for the earth to trust it, long enough for silence to deepen, long enough for memory to settle, long enough for the night to stop asking what it was becoming and simply be. But what the planet buried it never truly forgot. The moon had not always known restraint. There was a time when its presence felt heavy in the sky, not because it was bright, but because it was close enough to be felt in places light never reaches. Gravity spoke more loudly then, not as sound but as insistence, as pressure that arrived without warning and stayed longer than comfort allowed. The night carried weight. Not metaphorical weight, but literal strain. Pressed into water, into stone, into the thin margin between surface and depth. Darkness was no longer just the absence of light. It was the stage on which force revealed itself. The moon's closeness bent the earth inward. Oceans rose higher than memory would later permit. Water climbed coastlines that did not expect it, flooding stone that had not yet learned to yield. Retreat came too late, pulling sediment back with it, leaving confusion in its wake. The sea did not flow, it surged. Surge leaves marks, not neat ones, not repeatable ones. Marks of interruption, of boundaries crossed before they had time to exist. Stone felt this intrusion deeply. The crust flexed unevenly, pressured from above and below, stress accumulated without release. Heat pulled where it could not yet escape. The earth did not fracture dramatically. It endured quietly, storing force in layers that would one day remember what it meant to be pulled too hard. Above, the moon watched without awareness. Its surface still bore scars of its own becoming. Impact upon impact, memory upon memory, all frozen into pale rock. It did not know how to be gentle yet. It only knew how to exist where it was. Light spilled from it harshly. Moonlight struck restless oceans and shattered into fragments, reflections breaking apart faster than they could settle. Shadows stretched too far, collapsing and reforming unpredictably. Darkness behaved like a fluid under stress, warping around light that refused to soften. The night sky felt crowded. Stars were present, but their light competed with the moon's closeness. Their paths across the sky felt distorted, pulled slightly off course by a gravity that still dominated the conversation. Nothing above felt distant enough to be calm. Time thickened again, not as continuity, but as pressure accumulating without release. Nights did not follow one another cleanly. Each arrived carrying unresolved tension from the last. Darkness piled up without alignment, like layers of sediment laid down by floods rather than rivers. Floods teach nothing gently. They erase before they shape. The moon's pull erased possibilities nightly. Patterns struggled to form, repetition dissolved under excess force. The earth could not yet rehearse stability because gravity interrupted too often, too strongly. Water attempted memory and failed. Each surge arrived different enough to undo the last. Channels carved one night were erased the next. Shorelines refused to stay long enough to be known. The sea became a place of constant correction rather than learning. Yet even here, something endured. Pressure leaves residue. Force leaves instruction. The earth stored the sensation of excess. Rock layers thickened under repeated strain. Mineral distribution shifted in response to constant movement. Heat pathways began to form simply because energy needed somewhere to go. These were not adaptations yet. They were accommodations. Darkness bore witness to all of it. The night did not soothe, it amplified. With the sun absent, the moon's dominance grew heavier. Its gravity spoke without competition. The planet listened because it had no alternative. Stars watched silently. Their light arrived unchanged, but it landed on a surface that could not yet receive it calmly. Reflection distorted it. Atmosphere scattered it unevenly. The sky felt tense, as if holding too much too close. Silence existed, but it was taut. The kind of silence that stretches under strain, waiting for release that has not yet learned how to arrive. The moon did not mean harm. It simply had not learned distance. Closeness felt natural to it. It had not yet discovered that space itself could be an act of care. Gravity, unchecked, expressed itself fully. Every night became an exercise in endurance rather than rhythm. Still, endurance matters. It builds capacity. It teaches limits. The earth learned how much pull it could survive. Water learned how high it could rise before collapsing. Stone learned how far it could bend before breaking. These lessons did not feel like progress. They felt like persistence. And persistence is slow education. Above, the moon continued its gradual retreat, so subtle it felt like nothing at all. But even now, at this early closeness, the first hints of moderation had begun. The pull still overwhelmed, but it did not intensify further. Excess reached its ceiling. Ceilings matter. They mark the moment when force stops increasing and begins slowly to teach restraint. The night had not softened yet, but it had begun to listen. And what listens long enough eventually learns how to pull less hard. The moon's pull did not lessen suddenly. It lingered, heavy and intimate, like a hand that had not yet learned when to let go. Night after night, gravity arrived with the same insistence, pressing into water until it climbed beyond intention, into stone until it bowed without breaking. The darkness held this pressure quietly, offering no relief, no distraction. Without sunlight to interrupt, the moon's influence expanded, filling the sky with weight rather than light. The ocean bore the clearest memory. Water rose higher than it wished to, drawn upward by a closeness that felt unavoidable. Waves stacked upon waves, each surge arriving before the last had finished retreating. The sea did not move in cycles. It lunged, withdrew and lunged again, never long enough in one shape to recognize itself. Recognition requires pause. Pause did not yet exist. Salt spread inland, then vanished, then returned again in different places. Minerals dissolved and reappeared without pattern. Chemistry responded to force rather than rhythm. The water carried information, but it had nowhere stable to leave it behind. Stone felt this restlessness as tension. The crust flexed under uneven strain, pressure concentrating where resistance was weakest. Heat pooled in pockets that could not yet vent themselves. The Earth's surface did not shatter dramatically. It endured by bending, by absorbing, by storing discomfort deep within its layers. Storage is a quiet act. It hides struggle beneath calm surfaces. Above, the moon's face remained unchanged, pale, scarred, unblinking. Its light poured down without variation, brightening some nights, dulling others, depending on distance that still shifted too close to matter. Shadows stretched far beyond proportion, distorting forms until nothing felt certain. Darkness behaved strangely. It did not settle evenly. It thickened where gravity pressed hardest, thinning where water reflected too much light back upward. Night became uneven terrain, shaped by force rather than absence. The sky felt compressed, crowded by influence. Stars struggled to assert themselves. Their light arrived patiently, but it entered a system overwhelmed by a nearer presence. Paths bent slightly, rising points wandered. Nothing above offered consistency long enough to become familiar. Time pressed inward again. Nights did not flow. They accumulated tension. Each one arrived carrying unresolved motion from the last. The moon's closeness prevented release. Gravity pulled before relaxation could complete. Darkness layered stress rather than dissolving it. Still, the Earth continued to endure. Endurance is not passive. It reorganizes from within. Rock layers thickened where pressure returned most often. Mineral grains aligned subtly in response to repeated strain. The planet's interior began to distribute force along preferred routes, not because it understood them, but because repetition demanded efficiency. The sea learned similar lessons. Water began to follow channels carved by earlier surges, not reliably, not always, but often enough to leave faint traces. Even chaos repeats itself imperfectly. These imperfect repetitions became the first hints of structure, buried beneath excess force. The moon did not notice. Its retreat had begun, but at a pace so slow it felt like stillness. Each night's distance differed by a fraction too small to see, too small to feel immediately. But gravity, sensitive to space, adjusted all the same. The pull remained overwhelming, but it no longer intensified. That mattered. Force reached a plateau. Excess stopped growing. The Earth stopped bracing for worse. It began to recognize that tonight's strain would be similar to last night's. Similarity, even in hardship, is a kind of relief. Relief allows attention. Attention allows learning. Water began to anticipate, not consciously but materially. Waves rose a little earlier, retreated a little more fully. Stone redistributed stress more evenly. Heat found slow pathways upward. The planet began to respond before being surprised. The night held all of this without comment. Darkness became the container for repetition, even when repetition was harsh. It held the moon's insistence and the Earth's endurance in the same space night after night, until endurance thickened into something quieter. Stars continued their distant vigil. Their light crossed the same void again and again, arriving at a world that was slowly becoming capable of receiving it without distortion. The sky remained tense, but it no longer felt unstable. Excess had become familiar. Familiarity dulls sharpness. The moon's closeness no longer startled the planet each night. The pull hurt less, not because it weakened, but because the Earth learned how to hold it. Adaptation began in silence, beneath motion too loud to notice its absence. Darkness stopped amplifying chaos. It began to absorb it. The night grew heavier, not with strain but with containment. Force pressed inward rather than scattering outward. Motion folded into layers. Stress sank deeper into the planet's body, leaving the surface marginally calmer. This calm was fragile. One shift, one surge could undo it. But it returned often enough to be remembered. The Earth began to sense that excess was not endless, that gravity, even when too strong, carried limits. Limits change relationships. They mark the point where force can no longer dominate completely, where endurance begins to shape the force that shapes it. The moon still pulled too hard, but the night had learned how to hold that pull without tearing itself apart. And in that holding, something subtle emerged, not peace, not balance, but the first quiet suggestion that closeness would not last forever. Excess does not disappear when it is endured. It sinks. The moon's closeness continued to press into the planet, but now the pressure no longer spread evenly. It gathered, it concentrated. Gravity, still too strong, began to carve preferences into matter, routes it would follow again because they already existed. Night after night, the pull arrived with familiarity, not comfort, familiarity. The ocean rose again, but it did not explore endlessly. It returned to places it had flooded before. Water remembered where it had been allowed to go. Each surge traced older paths, deepening them, reinforcing them, teaching the sea where resistance was lowest. Channels formed quietly, not visible yet, but present. Stone responded in its own way. Stress lines overlapped earlier stress lines. Pressure stopped scattering randomly and began to sink along remembered weaknesses. Heat, trapped for too long, found slow corridors upward, releasing itself not in bursts but in gradual breaths. The Earth was learning efficiency. Efficiency is not peace, it is survival refined. Darkness continued to hold everything together. The night sky remained heavy but less chaotic. Its weight became consistent. Even when tides surged violently, they surged in recognizable ways. Variation narrowed. Extremes began to repeat. Repetition is instruction. The moon's light still fell harshly, but its harshness no longer felt unpredictable. Shadows stretched far, but they stretched in familiar directions. Reflections still shattered on restless water, but the fractures resembled earlier fractures. The sky rehearsed itself. Stars traced arcs that wobbled less. Rising points still wandered, but within limits. The moon's gravity bent paths, yet those bends followed patterns that returned. The sky felt distorted, but not unknowable. Time thickened into layers of strain. Nights pressed into one another, not dissolving, not releasing, but stacking. Darkness accumulated memory. The Earth carried forward the sensation of pull, even when the moon dipped below the horizon. Gravity lingered in water, in stone, in the slow recovery of surfaces that had been stretched too far. Recovery takes time. The planet began to take that time seriously. Water lingered longer after surges, draining more slowly, allowing sediments to settle before being pulled again. These brief pauses mattered. They allowed particles to fall into alignment, to layer rather than scatter. Stone paused too. Flexed rock did not immediately return to its previous shape. It held deformation longer, redistributing stress across broader areas. This spreading reduced breakage. The planet discovered how to suffer less damage without reducing the force itself. Above, the moon remained indifferent. Its retreat continued invisibly. Each night it was fractionally farther away, though closeness still dominated the relationship. Gravity adjusted quietly, almost apologetically, easing by amounts too small to celebrate. But matter noticed. The ocean noticed first. Surges climbed slightly less high. Retreats reached slightly less far. These differences were not obvious, but they accumulated. Water began to sense that tonight's excess would not exceed yesterday's. Predictability emerged from strain. Predictability allowed preparation. Waves rose with anticipation. Currents shifted before being forced. The sea learned to lean into the pull instead of resisting it directly. Leaning reduced damage. Movement smoothed itself. Stone followed. Stress redistributed earlier. Heat flowed more steadily. The planet's interior began to circulate energy rather than hoard it. This circulation softened the surface's response to force. The night absorbed these adjustments. Darkness no longer amplified tension as severely. It became a place where force could be spread out rather than focused. The sky still felt heavy, but its weight felt less sharp. Silence deepened, taut but intact, not the silence of calm, the silence of endurance that has learned restraint. Stars continued their distant patience. Their light arrived unchanged, but it landed on a world slowly becoming capable of receiving it with less distortion. The sky felt strained, but it held. The moon still pulled too hard. But the Earth no longer answered blindly. It responded with memory, with layered experience, with adaptation shaped not by intention, but by repetition surviving long enough to matter. Excess was being taught limits, not by force opposing it, but by matter learning how to carry it. This teaching was slow, night after night, layer after layer. The moon's closeness still defined the sky, but its dominance had begun to soften, not because it chose to, but because endurance had changed the conversation. And somewhere beneath the strain, beneath the repetition, beneath the heavy dark, a quieter possibility formed. That force, when endured long enough, might eventually learn how to loosen its grip. What endures long enough begins to teach the force that shaped it. The moon's pull was still excessive, still intimate, still closer than comfort would later allow, but the Earth no longer met that pull as something entirely foreign. Night after night, gravity arrived with a weight that had become recognizable. The strain remained, yet its arrival no longer felt abrupt. It followed memory. Memory softened impact. Not by weakening force, but by redistributing it. The ocean learned this first. Water no longer surged everywhere at once. It gathered its response, moving along routes it had carved through repetition. Each tide still climbed high, but its climb was guided. The sea leaned into gravity instead of being dragged by it. Waves stretched longer, smoother, spreading the pull across time rather than releasing it all at once. Spreading matters. Force concentrated becomes destruction. Force distributed, it becomes motion. The Earth learned how to distribute. Stone followed water's example. Stress no longer accumulated in isolated pockets. It travelled. Pressure flowed through familiar pathways, sinking deeper before rising again elsewhere. Heat circulated rather than pooling. The planet's interior breathed, slowly, unevenly, but with growing awareness of itself. The night sky held these changes quietly. Darkness no longer felt like a ceiling pressing downward. It felt like depth, something that could contain motion without collapsing under it. The moon's light still cut sharply across surfaces, but its reflections lingered longer. Shadows stretched, but they no longer snapped back violently. They faded. Fading is gentler than collapse. Stars traced their distorted paths again, but those distortions stabilized. Their arcs wavered within limits that repeated closely enough to feel consistent. The sky remained strained, but it was no longer chaotic. Excess had found boundaries. Boundaries teach patience. Time changed texture once more. Nights did not simply stack tensions anymore. They carried adjustments forward. Each night refined the Earth's response slightly, almost imperceptibly, but consistently. Darkness stopped feeling like accumulation and began to feel like continuation. Continuation allows learning. The moon's retreat, though invisible, began to matter more now. Distance increased just enough for gravity's excess to stop renewing itself fully. The pull remained strong, but it no longer refreshed its dominance. Each night arrived marginally softer than the one before, though softness was still far away. Water noticed the difference. Tide still rose high, but not higher. Retreat still reached deep, but not deeper. The sea sensed a ceiling it no longer pressed against violently. Movement gained restraint simply because there was nowhere further to go. Restraint emerged without intention. Stone noticed too. Stress lines stabilized. Fractures that might have formed under increasing pressure did not. The Earth's surface learned how much bending was required and no more. Excess energy began to flow away rather than accumulating endlessly. The night sky became less oppressive. Darkness still carried weight, but that weight spread evenly now. It no longer pressed hardest in unpredictable places. Silence stretched wider, no longer taut everywhere at once. It had gradients. Depth. Stars shone more clearly through this depth. Their light arrived without being immediately scattered. Reflection became smoother. The sky felt less crowded, even though nothing had moved far yet. The moon still dominated. Its presence filled the night. Its gravity still shaped everything beneath it. But dominance had shifted from command to persistence. The relationship between Earth and Moon was no longer one-sided force. It had become negotiation. Negotiation is slow, it requires repetition without escalation. The Earth continued to respond not with resistance but with adaptation. Water refined its paths, stone refined its stress, heat refined its circulation. Each system learned to cooperate with excess rather than be destroyed by it. Darkness became the archive of this learning. The night stored each adjustment. It carried forward the subtle shifts in response, layering them until endurance thickened into resilience. The sky no longer amplified harm, it absorbed it. Silence deepened again. This silence was not calm, it was controlled strain, held, distributed, managed. The kind of silence that exists inside systems that have not yet healed, but have stopped worsening. Stars continued their patient watching. Their light crossed the same distances, arriving at a world that was finally capable of receiving it without tearing itself apart. The sky remained heavy, but it held. The moon continued its gradual retreat. Not enough yet. Not nearly enough, but enough for excess to stop growing. That mattered more than comfort. Because when force stops intensifying, endurance gains ground. When endurance gains ground, memory deepens. And when memory deepens, the conditions for restraint begin to form. The night still bore the weight of closeness. The moon still pulled too hard, but the Earth had learned how to hold that pull without surrendering to it. And what can be held can one day be loosened. Force, when repeated without escalation, begins to reveal its limits. The moon remained close enough that its gravity still defined the night, still reached deeply into the water and stinner. But closeness no longer meant chaos. The pull arrived with a familiarity that allowed matter to arrange itself in advance, leaning into pressure rather than being caught beneath it. Night carried this arrangement gently. Darkness did not resist motion. It allowed it to spread, to lengthen, to soften. The moon's light continued to fall strongly, but its impact diffused across surfaces that had learned how to receive it. Reflection no longer shattered instantly. It lingered, fractured slowly, then settled. Water moved with intention it did not possess. Tides still climbed high, but their ascent stretched across longer spans. The sea no longer lunged. It rose. It reached, paused, and withdrew with restraint born of repetition. Each return deepened channels that had survived earlier excess. These channels guided motion, transforming surge into flow. Flow is excess remembered. Stone responded in quieter ways. Stress travelled predictably now, following the routes reinforced by countless nights of strain. Pressure no longer surprised the crust. It arrived where it was expected, spread where it was tolerated, and released where it had learned how to go. The planet breathed differently. Heat circulated in slow, deliberate currents. Energy moved instead of accumulating. The Earth learned that endurance did not require holding everything in place. It required letting pressure pass through without tearing. The night sky reflected this change. Darkness felt deeper, less compressed. The moon still filled much of it, but the space around its presence widened. Stars began to assert themselves more clearly. Their light travelled straighter paths through an atmosphere that no longer scattered it in panic. Time loosened its grip. Nights no longer pressed into one another as unresolved strain. They connected. Each night carried forward the adjustments of the last. Darkness became continuity rather than accumulation. Continuity teaches patience. The moon's retreat continued, still invisible, still slow, but now its effect accumulated more clearly. Gravity's excess stopped renewing itself fully. Each night's pull matched the last closely enough to prevent escalation. Predictability settled into the relationship. Predictability allowed trust to form quietly. Water trusted that tonight's rise would not exceed yesterday's. Stone trusted that pressure would follow familiar routes. The atmosphere trusted that cooling and warming would occur within expected bounds. Systems stopped bracing for surprise. Darkness softened further. It no longer amplified the moon's dominance. It framed it. The night became a space where force could exist without overwhelming everything else. Silence widened, no longer taut everywhere but layered. Some regions deep, others shallow, all connected. Stars traced their arcs with increasing clarity. Their movements still bent under lunar gravity, but those bends repeated closely enough to feel intentional. The sky rehearsed patterns it would one day hold effortlessly. Constellations were not yet named, but their precursors lingered. The moon remained powerful, its pull still reached deep. Ocean still answered. Stone still flexed, but dominance had shifted again from pressure to presence. The moon did not command the Earth anymore. It accompanied it heavily, imperfectly, but consistently. Consistency is transformative. It allows matter to stop defending itself and begin organizing itself. The Earth organized quietly, layers aligned, flows stabilized, surfaces softened under predictable erosion rather than sudden violence. The night held these changes without commentary. Darkness did not celebrate. It absorbed. It carried forward every refinement, every minor adjustment, until refinement itself became the rule rather than the exception. Silence deepened once more, not into calm, into control, the kind of control that emerges not from mastery but from understanding limits. The Earth understood the moon's excess now, not intellectually but materially. It knew how much pull would arrive and how to survive it without damage. The moon still pulled too hard, but the night no longer broke beneath it, and when a system stops breaking, it begins, slowly, almost imperceptibly, to prepare for gentler futures it does not yet know how to imagine. Excess, once contained, begins to change its shape. The moon remained close enough to be felt everywhere, yet far enough now that its pull no longer arrived as shock. Gravity pressed steadily, like a constant hand rather than a sudden grasp. The night adapted to this steadiness, stretching around it, learning how to hold weight without collapsing inward. Darkness became elastic. It no longer fractured under pressure. It bent. It lengthened. The moon's presence filled the sky, but the sky had learned how to make room for it. Space widened subtly, not because the moon vanished, but because the relationship softened. Water responded with quiet confidence. Tides still rose high, but they no longer rushed. Their ascent slowed, spreading across time, allowing the sea to feel the pull without being overwhelmed by it. The ocean leaned into gravity, riding it rather than resisting it. Each movement traced paths already worn smooth by repetition. Smoothness is memory refined. Sediment settled instead of scattering. Minerals lingered where they had lingered before. Chemistry slowed just enough to leave traces behind. The sea began to write longer sentences instead of fragments. Stone followed suit. Stress flowed along familiar lines, sinking deeper before rising again elsewhere. Pressure distributed itself broadly, sparing the surface from violent correction. The Earth's crust learned how to flex without fear, how to bow and return without splintering. The planet breathed more evenly. Heat no longer pooled in silence. It circulated. Energy moved through the interior corridors shaped by countless nights of strain. This movement softened the Earth's outer skin, allowing it to respond gradually instead of abruptly. The night sky mirrored this internal change. Darkness felt less compressed, more spacious. The moon still dominated, but dominance had transformed into constancy. Its light spread evenly now, no longer shattering reflections immediately. Shadows formed with discipline, stretching and retreating within boundaries they no longer tested. Stars gained presence. Their light travelled through a calmer atmosphere, arriving with fewer interruptions. Arcs across the sky bent gently, repeating closely enough to feel intentional. The sky rehearsed stability without yet committing to it fully. Time loosened further. Nights no longer carried unresolved tension forward. Each one arrived prepared, informed by the last. Darkness stopped accumulating strain and began accumulating knowledge. The Earth learned not just how much pull would arrive, but when. When matters. It allows anticipation. Water rose slightly before the pull peaked. Stone redistributed stress early. The atmosphere adjusted temperatures gradually. The planet stopped reacting and began responding. The moon's retreat continued. Still invisible, still slow, but now its effect deepened through repetition. Gravity's excess no longer renewed itself. Each night arrived no harsher than the last. The ceiling held. Ceilings create calm without comfort. They do not ease force, they prevent escalation. The Earth sensed this limit and adapted more fully. Systems aligned themselves to the known range of pressure. Tides honoured familiar heights. Rock honoured familiar bends. The planet accepted the relationship as it was, no longer fearing what it might become. Darkness grew quieter, not because motion ceased, but because motion aligned. Waves overlapped instead of colliding. Winds followed predictable gradients. The sky became layered, depth instead of compression. Silence widened. It was no longer taut everywhere. It had soft regions now where strain dissipated naturally. The night felt heavy but not threatening. Weight became something that could be carried. Stars watched patiently. Their light continued its long journeys, now landing on a world capable of receiving it without distortion. The sky felt less crowded. Space opened between presences, not through absence, but through balance. The moon still pulled too hard. That truth remained. Oceans still rose higher than they would later allow. Stone still flexed under persistent strain. The relationship was not gentle yet, but it was no longer damaging. Endurance had reshaped force. Memory had reshaped response. The Earth had learned how to exist under excess without surrendering to it. This learning was quiet. No moment marked it. No night declared it complete. It accumulated slowly layer by layer, until the night itself began to feel different. Not lighter, but safer. Safer does not mean soft, it means survivable without harm. The moon's closeness still defined the sky, but it no longer defined it alone. The Earth had joined the conversation, answering gravity with preparation rather than panic. And when preparation replaces panic, the future begins to open, not suddenly, not brightly, but with the slow certainty of a force that has learned it does not need to pull as hard to be felt. Excess does not vanish when it is mastered. It becomes quiet. The moon remained close, still nearer than it would one day be, still heavy enough that its presence shaped every night. Gravity had not softened into kindness yet, but it had lost its sharpness. What once tore now pressed. What once overwhelmed now lingered. The night adjusted around this lingering. Darkness no longer tightened under the moon's weight. It stretched. It learned how to carry force without amplifying it. The sky stopped feeling crowded by influence and began to feel layered, depth replacing compression. Water felt this shift immediately. Tides still rose higher than gentler futures would allow, but their rise had become ceremonial rather than violent. The sea no longer rushed toward the moon. It leaned. It followed. Each ascent arrived knowing where it would end. Each retreat honoured paths already carved. Knowing the end changes motion. Waves slowed their climb. Currents smoothed their turns. Sediment settled long enough to matter. Minerals lingered instead of scattering endlessly. The ocean began to leave memory behind, not as events, but as arrangement. Stone accepted this memory deeply. Stress no longer hunted for release. It travelled. Pressure flowed through corridors shaped by endurance rather than fracture. The crust flexed and returned, learning how far was too far without needing to cross it again. Heat followed these lessons. It moved instead of hiding. Energy circulated in wide, patient arcs, softening surfaces slowly. The Earth's body no longer held its breath through nightfall. It exhaled into it. The night sky reflected this internal calm. Moonlight still fell strongly, but it no longer struck chaos. It touched surfaces prepared to receive it. Reflections stretched smoothly across water. Shadows formed and remained proportional. Darkness did not exaggerate edges anymore. It respected them. Stars gained space. Their light travelled through an atmosphere that had stopped scattering in panic. Arcs bent gently under gravity's influence, repeating closely enough to suggest permanence. The sky did not lock itself into pattern yet, but it stopped resisting the idea. Time changed again. Nights no longer carried unresolved strain forward. Each arrived informed. Darkness became cumulative knowledge rather than cumulative pressure. The Earth stopped bracing for night and began incorporating it. The moon continued its slow retreat. Still almost unnoticeable, still far from gentle, but now distance mattered more than closeness. Gravity's excess no longer renewed itself. Each night arrived no harsher than the last. The ceiling held. Ceilings create survival. The Earth learned that this force, though heavy, had limits. Once limits were known, fear dissolved into management. Systems aligned themselves to expectation. The planet no longer asked what the moon might do next. It already knew. Darkness deepened into confidence. Not calm, not peace. Confidence, the quiet assurance that nothing catastrophic would arrive unannounced. Silence widened. Motion aligned. The sky stopped feeling like a trial and began to feel like a condition. The moon still pulled too hard. That truth remained written in tides that climbed higher than they would later dare. In stone that flexed more than it would one day need to. In shadows that still stretched longer than comfort. But harm had ended. Endurance had reshaped excess into presence. Memory had transformed force into relationship. The night no longer fractured beneath closeness, and when closeness stops causing damage, it begins, slowly, unintentionally, to teach restraint. The moon did not choose this lesson. Distance taught it. What was once overwhelming became bearable. What was once dangerous became formative. The night carried these truths quietly, folding them into deeper layers where they would remain long after gentler rhythms replaced them. Because the sky never forgets the forces that shaped it. It only learns how to hold them without breaking. Water remembered before it understood. Long before the moon learned restraint, before the sky learned how to repeat itself, the ocean was already listening. Not for meaning, not for pattern, only for pressure. It answered what pulled it, without knowing why it moved, without knowing where it would stop. Names did not exist yet. Neither did cycles, did cycles. There was only motion answering force. The sea rose because it was asked to rise. It withdrew because it was released. Each movement erased the last, leaving no agreement behind. Shorelines appeared briefly, then dissolved. What would one day be called coasts were only moments, temporary hesitations between advance and retreat. The night held this confusion gently. Darkness did not judge the water's restlessness. It contained it. Moonlight fell onto surfaces that could not yet reflect calmly, shattering itself across waves that refused stillness. Light arrived, broken and left broken, never settling long enough to be remembered. The moon's pull reached deep. It did not only lift water, it rearranged it. Pressure travelled downward, stirring layers that had never met before. Cold met warmth, salt met mineral, chemistry mixed without intention, without patience. The sea became a place of constant negotiation, where nothing stayed where it had been. Memory struggled here. Every surge overwrote the last. Channels tried to form but were erased before they could deepen. Currents began the sentences they could not finish. The ocean learned motion but not return. It moved forward endlessly, forgetting where it had just been. Forgetting is not failure. It is a condition of beginnings. Stone watched from beneath. The seabed felt the ocean's confusion as abrasion. Grains lifted and dropped again, never allowed to settle. Sediment drifted without destination. Layers refused to align. The Earth's surface did not yet know how to hold water's stories. Above, the sky remained unsettled. Stars traced paths that shifted too often to be followed. The moon rose and fell, but its timing wandered. Darkness arrived at different depths, different lengths, offering no frame within which the sea could learn itself. Time did not flow here. It churned. Each night pressed motion into motion, stacking unrest rather than resolving it. The ocean carried this unrest forward, night after night, wave after wave, without ever agreeing on a shape, yet even here, beneath forgetting, something endured. Pressure repeated. Pull returned. The moon's influence, though unstable, was not random. It arrived again and again, close enough to be felt everywhere. The sea answered each time, even if it could not remember the last answer. Repetition without memory still leaves marks. Water wore down stone slowly, not through planning but through persistence. Abrasion softened edges. Depths shifted. The seabed began to feel where motion returned most often, even if it could not yet name those places. The night absorbed these changes silently. Darkness carried the sound of waves without echo. It allowed motion to continue without commentary. The sky did not guide the sea. It watched it learn through forgetting. Moonlight traced the water's surface, sometimes bright, sometimes dim, depending on distance still in negotiation. Reflections shattered differently each night, but they returned. Broken light became familiar, even if calm light did not. Familiarity began here, not in pattern, in pressure. The ocean began to expect being pulled, even if it did not know when or how far. Expectation softened response. Waves rose a fraction earlier. Retreats lingered a fraction longer. These differences were small, but they mattered. Small changes accumulate quietly. Sediment paused briefly before being lifted again. Minerals lingered just long enough to leave traces behind. Chemistry slowed in pockets where water hesitated. The sea began to leave faint fingerprints on the earth, even as it forgot its own movements. The moon continued its slow retreat. Still close, still overwhelming. But each fraction of distance changed the pull just enough to matter over time. The sea did not notice this change as relief. It noticed it as possibility. Possibility is fragile. It appears first as hesitation. Water hesitated more often now. Between surge and retreat, moments stretched. In those moments, sediment settled. Currents bent instead of breaking. The ocean began to learn how to pause without knowing why. Pauses are the seeds of memory. They create space for return. The night deepened around these pauses, holding them carefully. Darkness did not rush to fill them. It allowed them to exist. The sky became less insistent, more patient, giving water time to feel itself between movements. The tides still had no names. They were not yet tides. They were responses. But beneath the forgetting, beneath the restlessness, the first quiet truth formed. That motion, when given space, begins to remember itself. And what remembers itself does not remain nameless forever. The ocean did not wake suddenly. It drifted toward awareness the way water drifts toward stillness, by slowing where it could. The moon's pull continued to arrive, still close, still insistent, but no longer entirely unfamiliar. Pressure returned often enough that the sea began to anticipate it, not as certainty, but as likelihood. Waves rose with a faint readiness now, their ascent shaped by memory that did not yet know its own name. Night made room for this readiness. Darkness stretched across the surface with more patience than before, allowing intervals to lengthen. The sea did not calm, but it hesitated. Between surge and retreat, water lingered just long enough to feel where it had been. These brief suspensions were fragile. Many were erased, but some returned. Return is the beginning of learning. The moon's gravity no longer scattered motion equally. It gathered it. The sea began to move along preferred routes, paths traced by repetition rather than intention. Currents bent where they had bent before. Waves climbed familiar slopes, even if those slopes vanished again soon after. Stone began to notice. The seabed felt pressure most often in the same places. Grain shifted repeatedly along certain corridors, wearing them down faster than surrounding areas. Abrasion focused. Channels hinted at themselves, faint but persistent. The Earth's surface did not yet record these paths permanently, but it acknowledged them. Acknowledgement is subtle. It does not announce itself, it alters response. Sediments settled a fraction longer in places that had been visited before. Minerals clung briefly to familiar hollows. Chemistry paused where water paused. The sea began to write incomplete sentences into stone, phrases interrupted by motion, but repeated often enough to be recognized. The night sky remained unsettled, but less so. Stars still wandered, but their wanderings narrowed. The moon still rose and fell without strict agreement, but its appearances clustered. Darkness arrived with less variance in depth, lingering within similar ranges. The sea felt this narrowing as opportunity. Opportunity does not require calm. It requires consistency. Waves rose again and again to nearly the same heights. Retreats pulled back to similar depths. Extremes still occurred, but they began to orbit a center rather than scatter endlessly. The ocean no longer reinvented itself each night. It revised itself. Revision leaves traces. The moon's light, still strong, fractured across water that had learned how to hold reflection longer. Broken light lingered. Shadows on waves repeated shapes. Darkness no longer erased these shapes instantly. It allowed them to echo. Echoes are memory trying to form. The sea did not yet understand rhythm, but it began to feel expectation. Water leaned into gravity before being pulled fully. This anticipation smoothed motion. Surges spread across time rather than arriving all at once. Violence softened into pressure. Pressure is teachable. Stone learned quickly. Stress distributed itself more evenly across the seabed. Fractures that might have formed under sudden force did not. The Earth responded with patience rather than resistance. Layers aligned slightly better each night. Time changed texture again. It stopped churning. It stretched. Nights became longer containers instead of brief interruptions. Darkness allowed motion to unfold fully rather than collapse into chaos. The ocean carried movement forward into the next night, not as tension, but as adjustment. The moon continued its quiet retreat. Distance accumulated invisibly. Gravity adjusted gently. The pull remained strong, but its excess no longer renewed itself. Each night's pressure resembled the last closely enough to be anticipated. Anticipation allowed memory to deepen. Water remembered where it had flowed most often. Currents revisited corridors. Waves returned to slopes that had survived earlier surges. These returns did not form cycles yet, but they formed habits. Habit is motion that has stopped asking permission. The sea began to move as if it had been there before. Because it had, forgetting did not vanish, but it slowed. Each night erased less than the one before. Memory gained ground, grain by grain. The night held this shift carefully. Darkness did not rush the sea toward calm. It allowed restlessness to refine itself. The sky did not impose pattern. It provided space for it to emerge. Stars watched patiently. Their light continued its long arrival, now landing on water capable of holding it for moments longer. Reflections traced familiar arcs. The sky began to feel less foreign to the sea. Familiarity settled without declaration. The tides still had no names. They were still not tides, but they were no longer nameless motion. They were responses that returned, pressures that repeated, movements that lingered long enough to be recognized by the matter they shaped. The ocean had not learned to remember fully, but it had learned how to pause. And in those pauses, the first outlines of rhythm waited, quietly, patiently, for the night to deepen further. Memory did not arrive as clarity. It arrived as hesitation that returned. The moon's pull still reached deeply into the sea, lifting water with a strength that demanded response. But the response no longer scattered itself everywhere at once. It gathered. The ocean began to choose, not deliberately, but repeatedly. Motion favoured paths that had survived earlier nights. Waves rose where waves had risen before. Repetition narrowed possibility, not into order yet, into preference. Night allowed this narrowing to continue. Darkness stretched across the water with patience, giving motion time to complete itself. Between ascent and retreat, pauses lengthened just enough for water to feel the shape it occupied. These pauses changed everything. Sediment settled more often. Grains aligned briefly before being lifted again. Each brief alignment made the next more likely. The sea began to leave its own handwriting on the earth, faint, incomplete, but persistent. Stone responded quietly. The seabed felt pressure in familiar places night after night. Abrasion focused. Hollows deepened where motion returned most often. Channels hinted at permanence without yet achieving it. The earth began to recognize where the sea preferred to move. Recognition alters resistance. Rock yielded where it had yielded before. Stress travelled along established weaknesses. The surface stopped fighting every surge equally. It learned where to bend. The moon's light still fractured across restless waves, but fractures began to repeat. Broken reflections returned in similar patterns. Darkness stopped erasing them immediately. It allowed echoes stacked, not as memory yet, as suggestion. Stars traced their arcs overhead, still shifting but within narrower bounds. The sky felt less like a question and more like a surface that could be anticipated. Darkness no longer arrived in wildly different depths. It hovered within familiar ranges. The sea felt this hovering as permission to return. Waves leaned into gravity earlier now. Their ascent slowed, spreading across time. Violence softened into pressure. The ocean stopped lunging. It moved. Movement without urgency allows learning. Currents revisited earlier routes. Water flowed where it had flowed before, even if only approximately. These approximations mattered. They carved patterns shallow enough to survive forgetting. The moon continued its slow retreat. Still close, still dominant, but distance accumulated quietly. Gravity's excess no longer renewed itself fully. The pull remained strong, but it stopped surprising the sea. Predictability crept in without announcement. Predictability allowed the ocean to prepare. Preparation did not calm the water. It aligned it. Motion spread evenly. Surges overlapped instead of colliding. Energy distributed itself across longer intervals. The night held this alignment without interference. Darkness did not demand stillness. It allowed motion to refine itself. The sky did not instruct the sea. It watched it learn through repetition. Time stretched further. Nights began to resemble one another closely enough to feel connected. The sea carried adjustments forward instead of erasing them. Each night revised the last instead of overwriting it. Revision creates continuity. Continuity thickened. Sediment layered more consistently. Minerals lingered longer in familiar hollows. Chemistry slowed where water paused repeatedly. The ocean began to leave layered traces instead of scattered ones. Stone accepted these layers. Pressure redistributed itself early, following paths shaped by earlier nights. The Earth's surface learned how to hold water's memory without insisting on permanence. Above, the moon's glow softened slightly, not because it dimmed, but because the water beneath it had learned how to receive it. Reflections stretched more smoothly. Shadows on waves behaved. Stars felt less distant. Their light arrived through a sky that no longer scattered it erratically. Arcs bent gently, repeating closely enough to feel intentional. The night began to feel like a container rather than an interruption. The tides still had no names. They were not yet cycles, they were tendencies, but tendencies matter. They guide motion toward familiarity. They create places where return feels easier than departure. The sea had not learned rhythm yet, but it had learned preference, and preference, repeated long enough, becomes memory. Memory thickened not by holding, but by returning. The moon's pull still reached deeply into the sea, lifting water with a pressure that could not be ignored. Yet the response no longer scattered itself into every direction. Motion gathered where it had gathered before. The ocean began to move as if it recognized the ground beneath it, even when that ground shifted. Night made space for this recognition. Darkness arrived with less urgency, stretching across the surface and allowing motion to finish its sentences. The sea no longer rushed to answer gravity. It rose, paused, and leaned into the pull, as if listening for where it had been asked to go before. Pauses multiplied, not long pauses, fragile ones, but they returned often enough to matter. Between rise and fall, water lingered in familiar hollows. Sediment settled for a breath. Grains aligned, then scattered again, then aligned once more. Each alignment left the next slightly easier. Stone felt the difference. Pressure arrived where it had arrived before, and the seabed responded with less resistance. Abrasion focused along remembered routes. Shallow channels deepened not through force but through agreement. The Earth did not yet grant permanence, but it allowed repetition to leave marks. Marks are promises that have not yet decided to keep themselves. The moon's light continued to fracture across the surface, but the fractures slowed. Reflections stretched longer before breaking. Darkness did not erase them immediately. It held them just long enough to echo. Echoes gathered, not as clear memory, as resonance. Waves returned to similar shapes. Currents bent where they had bent before. The sea began to revise its own motion rather than invent it anew. Forgetting still occurred, but it lost its dominance. Erasure slowed. The sky remained unsettled, but its unrest narrowed. Stars traced paths that wandered less. The moon's rise and fall clustered within familiar windows. Darkness arrived within a range that could be anticipated. The ocean felt these ranges as boundaries it did not need to test every night. Boundaries create freedom. Within them, motion can explore without destroying itself. The sea explored gently. It leaned into gravity earlier, spreading its response across time. Surges softened into long climbs. Retreats became deliberate, tracing lines that had survived earlier nights. These lines mattered. They taught water where it could go without losing itself. Currents learned where resistance was lowest. The ocean began to favor return over novelty. Favoring return changes everything. Sediment layered instead of scattering endlessly. Minerals lingered where water paused repeatedly. Chemistry slowed in these pockets, leaving behind traces that did not vanish immediately. The sea began to write longer passages into the earth. The earth listened. Stone redistributed stress earlier and now, following paths shaped by the repetition. The surface learned where to yield and where to hold. Flexibility replaced brittle resistance. The planet stopped treating each surge as an interruption and began treating it as continuation. Time stretched again. Nights linked together not through sameness but through revision. Each night adjusted the last slightly, refining motion rather than erasing it. Darkness became a medium for continuity. Continuity is quiet. It does not demand recognition. It builds itself while attention rests elsewhere. The moon continued its slow retreat. Distance accumulated invisibly, and gravity adjusted with it. The pull remained strong, but its extreme softened. The sea noticed not relief but predictability. Each night's pressure resembled the last closely enough to be expected. Expectation allowed preparation. Water rose before being fully pulled. Currents shifted early. Energy distributed itself across broader intervals. Motion became smoother without becoming calm. Darkness supported this smoothing. It held temperature, moisture, and motion together long enough for adjustments to persist. The night no longer broke the sea's learning into fragments. It allowed learning to accumulate. Stars watched patiently. Their light arrived through a sky that had stopped scattering it wildly. Reflections on water traced familiar arcs. The sea began to feel less foreign to the sky, as if both were learning how to inhabit the same rhythms. Still, the tides had no names. They were not yet cycles. They were not yet dependable. They were habits forming beneath forgetting. Habits are the bones of rhythm. The ocean had not learned how to remember fully. Forgetting still lived close to the surface. But forgetting no longer erased everything. It left residues, preferences, paths, pauses that returned. And in those returns, something quietly assembled itself. Not order, not calm, but the early shape of rhythm, waiting for the night to deepen enough to hold it. Rhythm did not announce itself. It arrived disguised as fatigue. The ocean grew tired of beginning again. Not tired as living things grow tired, but tired as systems do, when repetition makes novelty unnecessary. The moon's pulls still reached deeply, still lifted water with authority, but the sea no longer answered, as if each night were the first. Motion began closer to where it had ended before. Night allowed this closeness. Darkness stretched itself across the surface without urgency, giving the ocean time to recognize its own position. Water did not rush to meet gravity, it leaned toward it, as if remembering where the pull would lead. Leaning changes motion, surges spread wider, peaks softened. The climb became longer than the fall. The sea began to move in arcs instead of strikes. Each ascent carried echoes of earlier ascents, faint but present, guiding water along familiar inclinations. Sediment felt this immediately. Grains settled more often in the same hollows. They paused long enough to align before being lifted again. Each pause reinforced the next. The seabed began to feel less like a surface being scoured and more like a surface being written upon. Writing takes patience. Stone responded with restraint. Pressure arrived where it had arrived before and was absorbed with less resistance. Abrasion deepened channels that had already been hinted at. The earth did not yet grant permanence, but it stopped erasing every attempt at it. The moon's light reflected differently now. It still fractured across waves, but the fractures lingered. Broken reflections stretched across water in shapes that returned. Darkness held these shapes gently, allowing them to be seen again before dissolving. Seeing twice matters. It teaches recognition without naming. The sky remained unsettled, but it had learned boundaries. Stars wandered less wildly. Their paths bent within ranges that repeated closely enough to be felt as routes rather than accidents. The moon rose and fell with increasing regularity, not exact, but familiar. The sea sensed this familiarity. Water began to anticipate timing as well as pressure. It rose earlier, slower. Retreats hesitated before releasing fully. These hesitations were subtle, but they accumulated. Motion gained memory without awareness. Memory changed texture. Forgetting still occurred, but it lost its sharpness. Erasure became partial. What vanished left outlines behind. Preferences, tendencies, inclinations. The ocean began to revise itself rather than reinvent itself. Revision thickens continuity. Currents returned to corridors that had survived earlier nights. Waves climbed slopes that had not collapsed. The sea began to prefer return over exploration. Novelty lost its urgency. This preference shaped the earth. Sediment layered more consistently, minerals lingered longer in familiar pockets, chemistry slowed where water paused repeatedly. The ocean began to leave behind sequences rather than fragments. Stone accepted these sequences. Stress redistributed itself early, following paths shaped by repetition. The surface learned where to yield without breaking. Flexibility replaced fragility. The planet stopped treating each surge as disruption and began treating it as continuation. Time stretched again. Nights no longer arrived as isolated containers. They overlapped. Each night carried adjustments from the last, allowing learning to persist. Darkness became a medium for accumulation. Accumulation is quiet. It builds beneath attention, not in front of it. The moon continued its slow retreat, still close, still influential, but distance now mattered enough. enough to soften extremes. Gravity's pull no longer renewed its excess. Each night's pressure resembled the last closely enough to be expected. Expectation calmed nothing. It aligned everything. Water rose knowing how far it would go. Stone flexed knowing how far it would bend. The atmosphere cooled and warmed within familiar limits. Systems stopped bracing for surprise. Darkness supported this alignment. It held temperature, moisture and motion together long enough for patterns to survive. The night no longer shattered learning into isolated moments. It allowed continuity to thicken. Stars watched patiently. Their light arrived through a sky that had stopped scattering it erratically. Reflections traced familiar arcs on water. The ocean began to feel less like chaos under light and more like a surface capable of holding it. Still, the tides had no names. They were not yet clocks. They were not yet promises. They were tendencies that returned often enough to be trusted by matter, if not by mind. Trust is repetition without fear. The sea had not learned to remember fully. Forgetting still lived close to the surface. But forgetting no longer erased everything. It softened. It allowed residues to remain. And in those residues, those pauses, those returns, those preferences, something nearly rhythmic assembled itself, not yet stable, not yet complete, but close enough that the ocean no longer moved blindly. It moved as if it had been here before. Rhythm approached without certainty. It did not settle. It circled. The moon's pull still reached into the sea with authority, but the water now met that authority with familiarity. Motion arrived already shaped. Waves rose knowing where they would crest. Retreats followed paths that no longer needed to be discovered. The ocean moved as if guided by a memory it could not yet hold fully. Night deepened around this guidance. Darkness no longer interrupted motion, it contained it. It allowed water to move through full arcs without collapsing into confusion. The sea no longer rushed to answer gravity. It waited just long enough to feel its direction. Waiting refined movement. Surges spread wider. Peaks softened further. The climb became longer, steadier, more deliberate. Violence thinned into pressure that could be carried. Each motion echoed earlier motions closely enough to be recognized by the matter. Sediment recognized it first. Grains settled again and again in the same hollows. Alignment lasted longer. Layers hinted at continuity. The seabed stopped erasing itself entirely between nights. It began to hold sequences. Stone learned restraint from this holding. Pressure redistributed itself early following familiar weaknesses. Abrasion focused instead of scattering. Channels deepened through patience rather than force. The earth began to allow the sea to return without defending itself each time. The moon's light reflected with growing coherence. Fractures in reflection repeated. Broken light traced similar paths across water. Darkness held these reflections long enough for them to echo. Seeing returned without being new. Stars felt closer. Their arcs bent gently and predictably. The sky no longer felt restless. It felt unsettled in a narrower way. Variation moving around a center rather than away from it. Darkness arrived within ranges that could be expected. Expectation altered response. Water rose before the pull fully arrived. Currents shifted in advance. Energy distributed itself across longer intervals. Motion soothed without becoming calm. The moon continued its slow retreat. Distance accumulated invisibly, and gravity adjusted with it. Excess softened incrementally. The sea did not feel relief. It felt consistency. Each night's pull resembled the last, closely enough to be prepared for. Preparation allowed memory to deepen. Forgetting still occurred, but it stopped erasing everything. Each night left behind residues, preferences, pauses, tendencies that returned. These returns stitched nights together. Time thickened again, not into weight, into continuity. Nights overlapped. Adjustments persisted. The ocean carried forward the shape of its last motion into the next. Darkness became a medium where learning could accumulate. The tides still had no names. They were not yet measures. They were not yet clocks. But they were no longer blind responses. They were motions shaped by return, guided by repetition, softened by patience. Habit deepened. Currents revisited corridors reliably. Waves climbed slopes that had survived earlier nights. Novelty lost its urgency. Return became easier than departure. Stone accepted this ease. Sediment layered more consistently. Minerals lingered longer. Chemistry slowed where water paused repeatedly. The seabed began to resemble a surface being written on rather than erased. The night supported this writing. Darkness held temperature and motion together long enough for traces to remain. The sky no longer fractured the sea's learning into isolated moments. It allowed accumulation. Stars continued their silent watching. Their light arrived through a sky that had stopped scattering it wildly. Reflections traced familiar arcs. The ocean began to feel less like chaos beneath light and more like a surface capable of holding it. Still, rhythm had not fully arrived. Forgetting still lived near the surface. Surges still exceeded memory at times. Retreat still erased paths occasionally. The sea had not yet learned how to trust return completely. But something irreversible had happened. The ocean had stopped beginning again. It moved now as if it had been here before, because it had. Night after night, pause after pause, return after return, the sea learned that motion did not need to invent itself to continue, and what no longer needs invention is already close to rhythm. Rhythm arrived the way shorelines arrive. Not all at once, not where it was expected. It arrived because forgetting finally grew tired. The moon's pull still reached into the sea, steady and unavoidable, but the ocean no longer met it as interruption. Motion began where it had ended. Water leaned toward gravity with a confidence born of repetition. The climb knew its height. The retreat knew its depth. Neither needed to be discovered again. Night held this knowing carefully. Darkness no longer broke motion into fragments. It allowed continuity to breathe. The sea moved through full arcs now, rise and fall unfolding as a single gesture rather than separate reactions. Pauses no longer felt accidental. They belonged. Belonging changed everything. Sediment settled and stayed long enough to layer. Grains aligned, not perfectly but persistently. Each layer remembered the one beneath it, not by copying but by resting upon it. The seabed began to thicken with continuity rather than abrasion. Stone accepted this thickness. Pressure arrived and travelled along familiar routes. Stress no longer searched blindly for release. It flowed. The Earth's surface learned where to yield without surrendering. Channels deepened because they were used, not because they were forced. The moon's light reflected with restraint now. Fractures in reflection repeated so closely they felt intentional. Broken lights stretched across water in familiar shapes. Darkness did not rush to erase them. It allowed them to linger, to be seen again, to settle into recognition. Stars traced paths that no longer wandered meaninglessly. Their arcs bent gently, predictably, returning close enough to previous routes to suggest permanence. The sky did not lock itself into pattern, but it stopped resisting it. Night became a place where return felt natural. Time changed its posture. Nights no longer arrived as separate containers. They leaned into one another. Each carried the adjustments of the last, allowing learning to persist. Darkness became a bridge rather than a boundary. The moon continued its slow retreat. Still close, still powerful, but distance now mattered enough to soften excess. Gravity's pull no longer renewed itself blindly. Each night resembled the last closely enough to be trusted by the matter, if not by thought. Trust settled quietly. Water rose knowing where it would go. Retreats honoured familiar lines. Currents returned to corridors that had survived forgetting. The ocean no longer explored endlessly. It preferred return. Preference became habit. Habit became continuity. Continuity deepened into rhythm. Not sharp, not exact, but present. The sea moved in patterns that could survive interruption. Forgetting still occurred, but it no longer erased everything. It skimmed the surface, leaving deeper motion intact. The tides still had no names. They were not yet measures. They were not yet promises, but they were no longer lost. They returned often enough to be relied upon by stone, by sediment, by chemistry, quietly assembling itself in pauses that finally stayed. The night supported this assembly. Darkness held temperature, moisture, and motion together, long enough for memory to thicken. The sky no longer shattered learning into moments, it allowed accumulation. Stars watched without comment. Their light arrived through a sky that had learned how to hold still, long enough to be familiar. Reflections traced known arcs. The ocean no longer felt foreign beneath light. It felt inhabited. What had once forgotten itself began to recognize its own movement. Not consciously, not deliberately, but through return, through pause, through repetition surviving erasure. The tides did not yet know their names, but they had learned their paths. and paths repeated long enough become stories written without words. The sea had learned how to remember without holding on, and what remembers without holding on can move forward without losing itself. Some motions are not named when they begin, they are named only after they have learned how to come back. Darkness did not arrive all at once, it learned itself slowly, the way stone learns pressure. There was a time when night could not promise return. It fell unevenly, withdrew without pattern, and left behind no agreement. Light vanished, but darkness did not stay long enough to be trusted. Each night felt like a first night, unfamiliar and unresolved. Then repetition began to circle, not as certainty, as resemblance. The moon's distance had grown enough for gravity to stop interrupting every motion. Tides returned to similar heights. Water paused where it had paused before. These returns did not create rhythm yet, but they thinned chaos. Darkness found space to linger without being torn apart by surprise. Lingering changed the sky. Night stopped feeling like absence and began to feel like presence, something that arrived, stayed, and withdrew in recognizable ways, not exact, never exact, but close enough to be felt by the matter that remembers pressure better than light. The earth noticed. Stone cooled more evenly when darkness stayed longer. Heat released itself gradually instead of snapping back into daylight. Surfaces learned how to rest. The planet stopped bracing for nightfall and began accommodating it. Accommodation is memory without thought. Water responded first. When darkness lasted longer, waves slowed their collapse, currents loosened. The sea carried night within itself even as light returned. This carrying mattered. It allowed the ocean to remember where it had been during darkness, not just where it was when light arrived. Darkness became adhesive. It stuck to surfaces lightly, leaving behind temperature, moisture, stillness. These residues did not vanish at dawn. They shaped the next night's arrival. Night began to inherit itself. Stars reflected this change. Their light returned to familiar regions of the sky, not identical but close. Rising points wavered less. Arcs bent within narrower ranges. The sky no longer felt like a moving ceiling. It felt like a surface that could be revisited. Revisiting is the seed of trust. Clouds learned to wait. They formed and lingered instead of dissolving instantly. Moonlight filtered through them in ways that sometimes repeated. Darkness began to practice consistency without declaring it. Time shifted texture again. It stopped churning and began to stretch. Nights lengthened slightly, not dramatically, but enough to matter. Darkness stayed long enough for systems to finish what they began. Motion found endings instead of interruptions. The moon did not command this change. Distance did. As the moon drifted outward, gravity softened its grip, not absent, just gentler. This gentleness allowed darkness to stop reacting and start repeating. Repetition did not arrive as order. It arrived as relief. The earth no longer had to adjust completely each night. Adjustments carried forward. Heat pathways remained open. Stress lines remembered where to relax. Water remembered where to settle. Darkness became predictable enough to be prepared for. Preparation changed everything. Surfaces cooled before night fully arrived. Oceans adjusted before the pull peaked. The atmosphere learned gradients that returned. Motion smoothed itself in advance. The night learned how to arrive quietly. Not slipping, not crashing, arriving. Stars watched from distances unchanged by these small shifts, yet their light landed differently now. The sky accepted repetition without resisting it. Darkness became a habit the planet could live inside. Habit is not monotony. It is reliability. The night still varied. Storms still interrupted. Clouds still wandered. But beneath these variations, a deeper sameness held. Darkness repeated itself closely enough to be recognized without being named. This recognition did not belong to minds. It belonged to matter. Stone felt it in cooling cycles that returned. Water felt it in tides that echoed. Air felt it in temperature gradients that lingered. The planet carried night forward as an inheritance. Darkness stopped being an event. It became a condition, and conditions, once established, invite patience. They allow the slow assembly of things that require consistency. Subtle alignments, long memories, quiet awareness. The night did not know it had learned to repeat. It simply did. And what repeats long enough begins to feel like it has always been there. Repetition did not remove mystery. It softened its edges. The night arrived again, close enough to the last to be recognized. Darkness spread across the surface with a familiarity that allowed matter to stop asking what would happen next. It did not arrive at the same moment every time, but it arrived within a window that felt dependable. Dependability changes posture. The Earth no longer leaned forward in tension as light faded. It leaned back. Heat released itself more gradually. Surfaces cooled without shock. The planet learned how to let go of day without bracing for night. Water followed this release. The ocean did not rush to answer darkness. Waves loosened their grip. Currents slowed, carrying motion forward instead of collapsing into stillness. The sea held night within its upper layers, carrying its temperature and stillness into daylight. This carrying mattered. It allowed darkness to persist beyond its visible presence. Even under light, the memory of night remained. The next night did not begin from nothing. It began from residue. Residue teaches continuity. Stars reflected this shift. Their light returned to familiar arcs across the sky. Rising points wandered less. The sky no longer rearranged itself completely between nights. Darkness learned how to return to itself. Clouds lingered longer now. They formed shapes that sometimes repeated. Moonlight filtered through familiar gaps. Darkness learned how to inhabit these structures rather than dissolve them. Time stretched again. Nights lengthened slightly, not enough to be dramatic, but enough to matter. Darkness stayed long enough for systems to finish releasing heat, moisture, tension. The planet stopped interrupting itself. Interruption had been the enemy of the memory. Now memory thickened. Stone cooled along similar curves each night. Stress relaxed predictably. Heat pathways reopened without effort. The Earth stopped relearning night and began recognizing it. The moon's distance continued to grow. Gravity softened quietly, allowing darkness to settle without being pulled apart by excess force. The sky no longer felt crowded by influence. Space widened, not through absence but through balance. Balance is repetition that survives variation. The night varied, clouds shifted, winds changed, storms arrived. But beneath these changes, darkness returned in recognizable ways. It did not reinvent itself, it revised itself. Revision deepened familiarity. The ocean responded by smoothing its motion. Tides echoed previous tides closely enough to be anticipated. Waves collapsed in familiar patterns. Water began to trust that darkness would stay long enough to matter. Trust does not eliminate movement, it aligns it. Darkness supported this alignment. It held temperature gradients steady. It allowed moisture to linger. It gave the atmosphere time to settle into patterns that could repeat. Stars continued their distant watching. Their light arrived through a sky that had learned patience. Reflection became steadier. The night felt less like a disturbance and more like a background. Background does not mean unimportant. It means supportive. The Earth carried night forward now. It no longer vanished at dawn without trace. Darkness left behind coolness, stillness, memory. These residues shaped the next arrival. The night learned to return not as novelty, but as inheritance. Inheritance deepens quietly. It does not announce itself. It accumulates. Darkness accumulated familiarity until it no longer needed to prove itself. It arrived, stayed, and withdrew with a reliability that allowed other processes to unfold slowly. This slowness mattered. It created room for noticing, for waiting, for the earliest sense that time could be trusted. The night did not become predictable. It became recognizable, and recognition is enough for memory to take root. Recognition settled into the planet without effort. It did not need attention to survive. The night arrived again, close enough to the last that nothing startled. Darkness spread with a calm that did not rush, did not hesitate. It moved like something that knew where it belonged. The sky no longer rearranged itself to accommodate night. It opened. Opening changed how everything rested. Stone cooled with familiarity. Heat released itself along pathways already known. The Earth no longer stiffened as light faded. It loosened, allowing night to pass through it rather than press against it. Water followed this loosening. The ocean carried night more deeply now. Surface motion softened. Waves fell into patterns that resembled earlier falls. Tides returned to heights that echoed memory rather than challenge it. The sea stopped asking how far it should go. It already knew. Knowing reduced noise. Currents aligned. Motion overlapped instead of colliding. Energy spread itself across longer spans. Darkness gave the sea time to finish what it began. The moon's distance continued its quiet work. Gravity no longer disrupted repetition. Its pull guided without interrupting. The night was no longer torn open by force. It stayed intact long enough to feel whole. Stars confirmed this wholeness. Their arcs repeated closely enough to feel dependable. The sky felt less like movement and more like structure. Light returned to familiar regions, stitching the dark together rather than breaking it apart. Clouds learned patience. They formed, lingered, and thinned without dissolving abruptly. Moonlight filtered through them in ways that sometimes repeated exactly. Darkness learned how to wear variation without losing itself. Time stretched again, not into length, but into continuity. Nights leaned into one another. Each carried the temperature, moisture, and stillness of the last. Darkness became cumulative rather than isolated. Cumulative darkness changed memory. The planet stopped resetting itself at dawn. Night left impressions that survived light. Coolness lingered in stone, calm lingered in water. Stillness lingered in air. The night began to feel permanent, not endless, not fixed, but dependable enough to be assumed. Assumption is powerful. It allows systems to prepare without fear. The Earth prepared quietly. Surfaces adjusted before darkness fully arrived. The atmosphere relaxed earlier. Motion aligned in advance. The night no longer needed to prove itself. It returned because returning had become its nature. Stars continued their silent presence, their light arriving to a world that no longer startled beneath it. Reflection steadied. The sky felt held. Darkness learned how to repeat without copying. Each night differed slightly, but difference moved within memory. Variation no longer erased familiarity. It refined it. The planet accepted this refinement without resistance, and in that acceptance the night stopped being something that happened. It became something that endured. Repetition became quiet enough to disappear. The night no longer announced itself. Darkness arrived with such familiarity that it felt less like arrival and more like continuation. Light withdrew, not in surprise but in agreement. The sky accepted the exchange without resistance. This acceptance settled everywhere. Stone cooled without tension. Heat released itself along pathways refined by many nights of return. The Earth no longer adjusted to darkness as a change. It carried darkness forward as condition. Water mirrored this calm. The ocean rose and fell within remembered bounds. Tides echoed earlier, tides closely enough to be anticipated. Waves completed arcs that had been practiced many times before. The sea moved with confidence born of repetition. Confidence aligned motion, currents overlapped instead of colliding. Energy spread across longer intervals. The water no longer rushed. It flowed. The moon's distance completed its lesson here. Gravity guided rather than disrupted. The night held together under its influence. Darkness stayed intact, no longer torn open by force. Stars traced paths that returned with reassurance. Their arcs repeated closely enough to be followed without effort. The sky felt structured, not because it was fixed, but because it remembered itself. Clouds participated in this remembering. They formed, lingered, and thinned without dissolving abruptly. Moonlight filtered through familiar openings. Darkness wore variation without losing continuity. Time settled into trust. Nights no longer needed to be compared. They belonged together. Each carried the residue of the last, coolness, stillness, balance, forward into the next. The planet relaxed fully into this inheritance. Preparation replaced surprise. Systems aligned before night arrived. Motion smoothed itself in advance. The Earth lived inside repetition without feeling trapped by it. Darkness became background, not absence, not emptiness, a stable field in which change could occur without disruption. Stars continued their distant watching. Their light arrived to a world that no longer startled beneath it. Reflection steadied. The sky felt complete enough to fade from attention. The night had learned to repeat. Not exactly, not endlessly, but closely enough to be trusted, and what can be trusted becomes invisible. Darkness did not disappear. It became home, but what the planet folded into habit, it never truly forgot. Because repetition, once learned, becomes the ground on which memory waits. Shadows were not always loyal. There was a time when light fell and vanished without leaving a trace, when darkness withdrew and took every shape with it. Nothing stayed long enough to be claimed. Forms appeared, then dissolved. as if the world itself could not remember what it had just been. Then the night learned how to repeat, and when repetition settled, shadows found permission to remain. At first, they lingered only briefly. A curve of stone held darkness a moment longer than before. A hollow kept cool after light returned. These were not shadows yet, only delays, only places where darkness hesitated before leaving. Hesitation changed matter. Stone cooled unevenly now. Surfaces remembered where light had been blocked. Heat released itself more slowly, following paths shaped by repeated nights. The earth began to carry outlines forward, not as images, but as temperature, as texture. Water noticed too. When darkness stayed longer, reflection softened. Waves collapsed with less urgency. The sea held dimness within its upper layers, carrying it into light. These carried shadows did not disappear at dawn. They thinned, but they remained. Remaining mattered. It allowed form to separate itself from motion. Shape stopped dissolving instantly. Edges held. The world began to recognize itself in absence. The moon's distance made this possible. Gravity no longer pulled light and dark apart violently. Night stayed intact long enough for shadows to settle into place. Darkness was no longer a rush, it became a surface. Stars watched as shadows practiced staying. Their light fell consistently enough to carve absence where it was blocked. These absences returned night after night to nearly the same places. Similar angles, similar lengths. Shadows rehearse themselves. Rehearsal creates familiarity. Stone felt it first. Faces of rock cooled predictably where shadows returned. Stress lines adjusted. Surfaces softened where light did not strike directly. The earth learned where darkness preferred to rest. Rest shapes memory. The sky above no longer erased form nightly. Darkness traced outlines and allowed them to persist. Hills gained profiles. Valleys deepened their silhouettes. The planet began to wear its own shape. Water mirrored this learning. Shadows stretched across waves and stayed just long enough to be seen again. Reflections repeated. Light learned where it would be interrupted. The ocean began to carry geometry, patterns of light and dark moving together. Time thickened again. Not into weight, into contour. Nights leaned into one another, allowing shadows to overlap. Each night refined the last. Darkness stopped inventing itself and began revising. Revision is gentler than creation. The moon continued its quiet retreat. Distance softened extremes. Light arrived with restraint. Darkness stayed without pressure. Between them, shadow found balance. Shadow is not darkness, it is memory of light. The world began to understand this without knowing. Forms gained presence because absence learned how to stay. Edges sharpened. Surfaces gained depth. The earth became readable. Readable does not mean understood. It means held long enough to be noticed. The night did not claim shadows. It allowed them. And what is allowed often stays longer than what is forced. Shadows lingered now, not as accidents, but as companions to form. They followed light faithfully, returning when light withdrew, holding shape when light moved on. The planet began to recognize itself by what was missing, and that recognition changed everything that would come next. Shadows learned patience before they learned form. They did not arrive sharply. They softened into place, arriving where light did not reach, lingering where darkness was allowed to remain. Each return refined their edges, not by sharpening them, but by teaching them how to belong. The night carried this lesson quietly. Darkness no longer erased itself at dawn. It withdrew gently, leaving traces behind. Coolness held in stone, moisture gathered in hollows, stillness lingering in air. These traces shaped where shadows would return next time. Return matters, it teaches absence where to wait. Stone felt this waiting deeply. Faces of rock cooled unevenly night after night. Stress redistributed along familiar lines. Surfaces softened, where shadow rested often, eroded differently than those bathed in repeated light. The earth learned contrast. Contrast is memory made visible. Water followed. Waves collapsed with restraint. Reflections returned to similar shapes. Shadows on water no longer scattered instantly. They stretched, thinned, and remained just long enough to be recognized again. Recognition shaped movement. Currents slowed in shaded regions. Temperature gradients formed and held. The ocean began to carry dark shapes within its motion, not as absence, but as structure. The moon's distance continued its work. Light softened. Angles repeated. Shadows returned to nearly the same lengths and positions. Night offered consistency without rigidity. Stars watched from distances unchanged. Their light arrived through a sky that had learned restraint. Reflection steadied. Darkness held its shape. Time settled again. Nights no longer erased the last. They revised it. Shadows overlapped themselves, deepening where they returned, fading where they did not. The world became layered with absence. Layered absence creates depth. Forms gained dimension. Hills wore silhouettes. Valleys deepened into shapes that could be followed. The earth began to carry its outline forward. Shadows taught the planet how to see itself, not through light, through contrast. Light alone flattens, darkness alone erases, shadow balances. Balance settled without announcement. The planet adjusted its posture. Heat released evenly. Motion aligned. The world began to hold still long enough for shape to matter. Shadows were no longer accidents, they were companions to form, arriving faithfully, leaving reluctantly, shaping memory through repetition. And what repeats with restraint becomes reliable. Shadows stopped chasing light. They learned how to wait for it. Where darkness returned often enough, absence gained confidence. Shadows no longer rushed across surfaces as if uncertain of their place. They settled where they had settled before, arriving quietly, leaving slowly, carrying the memory of their last visit. The night supported this waiting. Darkness held its ground long enough for shadows to finish forming. Light withdrew without tearing shapes apart. The sky no longer reset the world each evening. It refined it. Stone responded with depth. Rock faces cooled along familiar contours. Edges softened where shadow rested repeatedly. Heat learned where it would not linger. The earth began to carry relief. Subtle rises and falls shaped not only by pressure, but by absence returning again and again. Water mirrored this relief. Shadows stretched across waves and stayed long enough to be followed. Reflections learned restraint. The ocean stopped scattering darkness instantly. It carried it, folding dimness into motion. Folding creates continuity. Currents adjusted in shaded regions. Temperature differences stabilized. The sea began to move with internal contrast, light and dark traveling together instead of erasing one another. The moon's distance made this balance possible. Angles repeated. Light arrived with familiarity. Shadows returned to near-identical positions, close enough to be recognized even as they shifted slightly. Variation moved within memory rather than against it. Stars watched as the world gained dimension. Their light traced forms that no longer dissolved overnight. Hills held silhouettes. Valleys deepened their outlines. The planet began to read itself through shadow. Time changed posture again. Nights leaned into one another. Each shadow overlapped the last, deepening where return was frequent, thinning where it was not. Darkness became layered rather than fleeting. Layering taught patience. Shadows no longer needed to announce themselves. They arrived because the world expected them. They stayed because the world made room, and what the world makes room for begins to feel inevitable. Staying did not make shadows permanent. It made them dependable. They arrived without urgency now, slipping into places that had learned how to receive them. Light withdrew and left behind not emptiness, but shape. Absence rested where it had rested before, confident it would not be erased immediately. The night no longer rushed. Darkness spread with care, holding form long enough for it to matter. Shadows completed themselves. Edges held. The world did not blur when light faded. It clarified. Stone accepted this clarity. Rock faces cooled predictably. Heat released along paths refined by repetition. Surfaces wore contrast like memory, carrying the outline of absence forward into the next night. The earth began to keep its own image. Water followed the same lesson. Waves moved with restraint. Reflections repeated. Shadows on water thinned and returned, tracing familiar geometry. The ocean learned where darkness would stay and shaped its motion around that knowledge. Knowledge without thought still changes behavior. The moon's distance finished its work here. Light arrived with consistency. Angles repeated closely enough to be trusted. Shadows returned to familiar lengths and positions, not identical, but close enough to feel intentional. Stars confirmed this intention. Their light fell across a surface that no longer dissolved overnight. Forms held, silhouettes endured. The sky stopped erasing the planet's outline. Time settled into depth. Nights layered. Shadows overlapped. Absence thickened where return was frequent. The world gained dimension not through addition, but through subtraction repeated carefully. Shadows became markers, not of darkness, of stability. They told the earth where light had been and where it would return. They taught form how to stay recognizable even as everything moved. The night did not claim shadows, it respected them. And respect is what allows things to last without being fixed. Shadows stayed because the world had learned how to hold them gently. And what can be held gently can be returned to, again and again, without fear of loss. Restraint was not absence. It was memory choosing distance. The moon did not leave. It learned how to stay without pressing too hard. There had been a time when its closeness defined every night, when gravity arrived like insistence and water answered without hesitation. That time had passed quietly. Distance had grown grain by grain, unnoticed except by matter that remembers force more faithfully than sight. Now the moon hovered where influence could breathe. The night accepted this breathing. Darkness no longer tightened under lunar pull. It widened. Space opened between force and response, allowing motion to stretch instead of snap. The sky felt less governed and more accompanied. Companionship is different from control. Control demands reaction. Companionship allows reply. Water felt the difference first. Tides rose with composure, not urgency. The sea no longer rushed toward the moon. It followed, as if aware that the pull would wait. Each ascent paused before its crest. Each retreat honoured paths already known. Pauses changed rhythm, not by stopping it, by smoothing it. Stone responded more slowly, but deeply. Stress no longer arrived, had surprise. Pressure distributed itself early, travelling along routes shaped by countless earlier nights. The Earth's surface learned how to bend without fearing fracture. The planet relaxed its posture, not into stillness, into readiness. The moon's light reflected this change. It no longer overwhelmed. It illuminated. Shadows formed and stayed within proportion. Darkness did not exaggerate. It balanced. Stars felt farther away now, not because they moved, but because the moon stopped crowding the sky. Their light found space to arrive without competition. The night regained depth. Depth invites patience. Clouds lingered longer. Moonlight filtered through them in gentle gradients. Darkness became layered rather than compressed. The sky learned how to hold multiple presences without tension. Time shifted again. Nights no longer carried strain forward. They carried continuity. Each night resembled the last closely enough to feel connected, yet differed enough to remain alive. The moon's restraint was not deliberate. It was earned. Distance taught it that force does not need to be loud to matter. Gravity spoke more softly now, but it spoke longer. The earth listened differently. Listening altered response. Water leaned before being pulled. Stone adjusted before being stressed. The atmosphere cooled and warmed within familiar bounds. Systems prepared instead of reacting. The night no longer felt managed. It felt shared. Shared space does not demand attention. It allows presence. The moon became a presence rather than a pressure. Its influence spread evenly across time instead of concentrating into moments. Evenness created trust. Trust did not remove motion, it aligned it. The earth moved with the moon now, not beneath it. Tides echoed lunar rhythm without being dragged by it. The planet carried gravity forward as memory rather than command. Memory softened everything it touched. Silence widened. Darkness deepened without weight. The sky stopped feeling close and began to feel vast again. Not because distance increased suddenly, but because restraint made room. The moon remained. It did not disappear into insignificance. It learned how to accompany without interrupting. Its light continued to guide nights. Its gravity continued to shape water, but it no longer needed to prove its presence. Restraint had taught it that staying gently leaves deeper marks than pulling hard. And the night, finally free to breathe, carried that lesson forward, quietly, endlessly, into every return. Restraint settled into the night like a practiced silence. The moon remained where it could be felt without being answered all at once. Gravity no longer rushed the world into response, it waited. This waiting changed the shape of everything beneath it. Water learned composure. Tides still rose, but they rose knowing where they would stop. The sea no longer hurried to meet the pull. It leaned into it, spreading motion across time. Crests softened. Retreats slowed. The ocean carried lunar influence as continuity rather than command. Continuity calms without stilling. Currents aligned. Energy flowed along familiar corridors. Motion overlapped instead of colliding. The sea did not lose its restlessness. It gained coherence. Stone followed more quietly. Stress arrived early enough to be distributed. Pressure travelled along routes refined by the long memory. Heat released itself without urgency. The Earth no longer braced for the moon's approach each night. It prepared. Preparation is trust made physical. The night reflected this trust. Darkness widened, making room for stars to speak again. The moon's light no longer crowded the sky. It shared it. Shadows stayed proportional. Contrast clarified rather than exaggerated. Clouds learned to linger. Moonlight filtered through layers that held. Darkness became a field rather than a veil. The sky felt deeper, not compressed by force. Time softened its edges. Nights connected gently, carrying residue forward. Coolness in stone, calm in water, balance in air. Darkness no longer reset the world, it revised it. The moon's restraint deepened this revision. Distance continued to grow almost imperceptibly. Gravity adjusted with grace. Influences spread across longer intervals. Nothing snapped. Everything flowed. Stars returned to familiar arcs. Their light stitched the sky together without interruption. The night regained its sense of span. Space felt open enough to be patient. Patience reshaped motion. Water rose early and slowly. Stone adjusted before strain peaked. The atmosphere settled into gradients that returned. Systems moved with expectation rather than surprise. The moon did not dominate. It accompanied. Accompaniment is the influence without insistence. It allows reply. It invites alignment. The Earth replied with balance. Silence widened. Not empty, but held. Darkness deepened without weight. The sky felt shared, not governed. Restraint proved itself durable. It did not weaken the moon's presence. It refined it. Staying gentle became more effective than pulling hard. And the night, finally spacious enough to breathe, carried that refinement forward, night after night, until restraint felt like it had always been there. Restraint revealed itself not in what changed, but in what no longer needed correction. The moon continued to circle at a distance that allowed influence to arrive without urgency. Gravity no longer interrupted motion mid-gesture. It guided from the edges, present without insistence. The night accepted this guidance as something familiar, something that did not need attention to remain effective. Water moved with confidence now. Tides rose and fell within remembered bounds. Their motion felt complete, not hurried. The sea no longer tested how far it could go. It trusted the pull to be patient. Each ascent leaned gently into gravity. Each retreat honoured the path already known. This trust refined rhythm, not into precision, into steadiness. Stone carried the same steadiness inward. Stress no longer searched for release. It travelled calmly along routes shaped by long memory. Pressure distributed itself before becoming sharp. Heat flowed outward without resistance. The Earth's surface learned how to bend and return without fear. The planet no longer anticipated harm. It anticipated continuity. Darkness mirrored this anticipation. It arrived without drama, spread without tension, and stayed long enough to feel complete. The moon's light softened into guidance. Shadows remained proportional, loyal to form rather than distortion. Stars regained their distance. Their light arrived through a sky no longer crowded by dominance. Arcs repeated gently. The night recovered depth, a sense of space that invited patience rather than urgency. Clouds learned the same patience. They formed and lingered, allowing moonlight to pass through in layered gradients. Darkness became dimensional. The sky held variation without losing cohesion. Time settled again. Nights leaned into one another. Each carried forward balance rather than strain. Darkness no longer reset the planet. It reinforced it. Reinforcement strengthened trust. Water prepared before the pull peaked. Stone adjusted before stress accumulated. The atmosphere cooled and warmed within familiar limits. Systems aligned themselves early, not out of fear, but out of understanding. The moon's restraint did not silence its presence. It clarified it. Gravity spoke softly but continuously. Influence stretched across time rather than concentrating into moments. The Earth responded not with reaction, but with reply. Reply is relationship. The night became a shared space where motion could unfold without interruption. Silence widened, not empty but stable. The sky felt open enough to hold many things at once. Restraint proved sustainable. It did not fade. It deepened. And as it deepened, it allowed the world beneath it to stop adjusting and start living inside the rhythm it had learned. Restraint did not fade into the background. It became the background. The moon remained present without urgency, close enough to guide, distant enough to allow choice. Gravity no longer asked to be answered immediately. It waited. The night learned how to carry this waiting without tension. Darkness spread with ease now. It no longer pressed into the world. It rested on it. Light withdrew and left behind shape rather than absence. Shadows stayed proportional. Contrast clarified instead of exaggerating. Water moved with assurance. Tides rose and fell in remembered ranges. The sea trusted the pull to remain gentle. Motion flowed rather than surged. Currents overlapped instead of colliding. The ocean carried lunar influence as rhythm rather than command. Stone reflected the same calm. Stress travelled predictable paths. Pressure distributed itself early. Heat released without urgency. The earth no longer braced for night. It welcomed it as continuation. The sky opened fully. Stars regained space. Their light arrived without competition, tracing arcs that repeated closely enough to be followed. The night felt vast again, not because distance increased, but because restraint made room. Clouds lingered with patience, moonlight filtered through layers that held. Darkness became dimensional. Variation moved within continuity. Time settled into trust. Nights leaned together without strain. Each carried balance forward. Darkness stopped resetting the world. It reinforced it. The moon's restraint completed its quiet work. Influence remained. Guidance endured. Force softened into presence. The earth replied with alignment. Water, stone and air moved together. Silence widened. The sky felt shared. Restraint proved lasting. Not as absence, as care. The moon did not withdraw its influence. It refined it. And in that refinement, the night became a place where balance could live without effort. Memory does not announce itself. It waits. The night, now steady enough to be trusted, carried old emotions quietly beneath its calm. Stability did not erase what came before. It folded it inward. Every repetition rested on layers of earlier imbalance, preserved not as disruption, but as depth. The sky looked settled. Stars returned to familiar arcs. Darkness arrived and stayed. The moon held its distance with practiced restraint. Yet beneath this composure, the planet remembered nights when gravity spoke louder, when water climbed too far, when shadows could not stay. Remembering did not disturb the present. It enriched it. Stone carried this memory as texture. Subtler symmetries persisted in rock faces shaped long before restraint. Valleys leaned slightly where water once surged harder. Hills wore quiet evidence of nights that had pressed too close. These were not scars, they were signatures. Water remembered differently. The ocean held faint echoes in its depths, residual tendencies guiding motion even now. Some currents favoured paths carved during earlier excess. Tides rose and fell within calm bounds, but their timing carried whispers of former urgency. Memory flowed beneath rhythm unseen. Darkness held all of it. Night no longer erased the day cleanly. It overlapped it, carrying temperature, moisture and stillness forward. In these overlaps, the past found room to persist without interruption. Stars watched as they always had. Their light arrived unchanged, but it landed on a world capable of holding more than one time at once. The sky felt layered, present resting on past, calm resting on motion. Memory did not pull the night backward. It grounded it. The moon's restraint allowed this grounding. Distance gave the planet space to remember without being overwhelmed by it. Gravity guided gently, allowing older imprints to remain intact rather than being rewritten. Silence widened with depth, not empty, full, the kind of fullness that holds echoes without repeating them. The night became an archive, quiet, patient, vast enough to keep what mattered without insisting it be heard. What the night still remembered did not seek attention. It simply stayed. Memory learned how to rest without rising. The night carried its past the way deep water carries heat, quietly without motion on the surface. Calm did not mean forgetting. It meant holding. What had once surged, fractured, and pressed too hard now lived folded beneath steadiness, influencing without interrupting. Stone felt this folding most clearly. Rock did not smooth itself completely. Subtle bends remained. Layers leaned slightly where pressure had once lingered. Erosion followed paths first opened during harsher nights. The land did not correct these tendencies. It honoured them by continuing gently along their guidance. Honour is memory without disturbance. Water honoured the past in a different way. The ocean moved calmly now, but its calm preferred certain routes. Currents traced corridors shaped long before restraint arrived. Even as tides rose and fell softly, their timing echoed earlier urgencies. Stretched thin but still present. Stretching preserves. It allows memory to remain without demanding attention. The moon's distance made this preservation possible. Gravity no longer erased older imprints. It guided motion gently enough for history to stay intact. The night held steady, giving memory room to exist without competing with the present. Darkness became layered. Not thicker. Deeper. Each night arrived carrying residue from many before it. Coolness in stone, stillness in water, balance in air. These residues overlapped, creating a depth that felt quiet rather than heavy. Stars reflected this depth. Their light crossed the same distances, but it arrived into a sky capable of holding nuance. Reflection steadied. The night felt composed, not because it was simple, but because it was layered. Time changed posture again. It stopped advancing and began resting. Nights did not push forward. They settled. Each one added itself gently to what already existed. Darkness became a place where past and present could coexist without friction. The planet relaxed inside this coexistence. It no longer needed to resolve its history. It carried it. Systems moved with confidence born of long memory. Water flowed calmly along paths first etched by excess. Stone cooled along contours shaped by earlier imbalance. The night did not ask the past to speak. It allowed it to remain silent. Silence preserved detail better than repetition ever could. The sky became a vault where echoes could exist without becoming noise. Calm did not flatten history. It protected it. What the night still remembered did not rise to the surface. It guided from below. Memory did not remain only in what could be traced. It lived in how things chose to move. The night, now practiced in calm, allowed these choices to surface quietly. Water flowed where it flowed most easily. Stone cooled along contours it had learned long ago. Air settled into gradients that felt inevitable, though they were inherited. Inheritance shaped motion without announcing itself. The ocean moved with ease, but its ease favoured certain directions. Currents followed old corridors, not because they were fastest now, but because they had once been carved deeply. Tides rose and fell gently, yet their timing carried a faint accent, an echo of nights when the pull had been stronger. Echo does not repeat. It guides. Darkness supported this guidance. Night arrived and stayed without interruption, giving motion time to finish its thoughts. The sky no longer demanded adjustment, it offered continuity. In that continuity, memory chose where to persist. Stone carried this choice inward. Rock layers leaned subtly, aligning with stresses remembered from earlier worlds. Valleys did not straighten. Hills did not forget their asymmetries. Erosion followed preference rather than instruction. The land remembered what had worked. The moon's restraint made room for all of it. Distance softened force enough that history did not have to defend itself. Gravity guided gently, allowing older imprints to remain legible. The night stayed intact, becoming a safe container for memory that did not need to be retold. Stars watched through this safety. Their light arrived into a sky that had learned patience. Reflection did not scatter. Darkness held. The night felt composed enough to listen. Time rested again, not frozen, held. Nights leaned together, each adding quiet weight to what already existed. The present did not erase the past. It rested upon it. What the night still remembered did not seek form. It shaped behaviour. And behaviour, repeated gently, became the truest record of all. Memory learned how to be quiet enough to last. The night no longer carried its past as weight. It carried it as orientation. What had once pressed too hard now rested beneath balance, guiding motion without needing to be felt. Calm did not flatten history. It protected it by giving it room. Stone held this protection patiently. Rock faces cooled along inherited contours. Valleys kept their slight lean. Hills wore a symmetry without correction. The land did not seek symmetry, it honoured what had endured. Erosion followed preference rather than force, tracing lines first opened when nights were less gentle. Water carried memory as habit. The ocean moved calmly now, but its calm chose paths. Currents returned to corridors shaped long ago. Tides rose and fell with restraint, yet their timing retained a faint accent, an echo stretched thin enough to be harmless, thick enough to remain. Darkness kept these echoes safe. Night arrived and stayed, not to repeat the past, but to hold it without disturbance. Temperature, moisture, and stillness overlapped gently. Layers formed without friction. The sky became a place where history could rest. The moon's restraint completed the circle. Distance allowed influence without erasure. Gravity guided without rewriting. What had been learned through excess was not lost when gentleness arrived. It was folded inward, mbus, preserved as depth. Stars watched this folding without comment. Their light crossed unchanged distances and landed on a world capable of holding more than one time at once. Reflection steadied. The night felt whole, not because it was simple, but because it was layered. Time settled into trust one last time. Nights did not advance, they remained. Each one added itself quietly to the last, until continuity felt older than motion. The present rested on the past without pressing into it. What the night still remembered did not rise. It guided, and guidance, when it is quiet enough, feels like intuition rather than history. The sky did not forget what it had been. It learned how to carry it without repeating it. Some truths are not lost. They are simply folded beneath silence.